Chapter 17 of The Red Planet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sean Michael Hogan. The Red Planet by William J. Locke. Chapter 17. Mrs. Boyce was shown into my study, her comely Dresden china face very white, and her hands shaking. She held a telegram. I had seen faces like that before. Every day in England there are hundreds thus stricken. I feared the worst. It was a relief to read the telegram and find that Boyce was only wounded. The message said seriously wounded, but gave consolation by adding that his life was not in immediate danger. Mrs. Boyce was for setting out for France forthwith. I dissuaded her from a project so embarrassing to the hospital authorities and so fatiguing to herself. In spite of the chivalry and humanity of our medical staff, old ladies of 70 are not welcome at a busy base hospital. As soon as he was fit to be moved, I assured her, he would be sent home, before she could even obtain her permits and passes and passport and make other general arrangements for her journey. There was nothing for it but her Englishwoman's courage. She held up her hand at that, and went away to live, like many another, patiently through the long hours of suspense. For 2 or 3 days no news came. I spent as much time as I could with my old friend, seeking to comfort her. On the 3rd morning, it was announced in the papers that the King had been graciously pleased to confer the Victoria Cross on Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Boyce for conspicuous gallantry in action. It did not occur in a list of honours. It had a special paragraph all to itself. Such isolated announcements generally indicate immediate recognition of some splendid feat. I was thrilled by the news. It was a grand achievement to win through death to the greatest of all military rewards deliberately coveted. Here, as I had strange reason for knowing, was no sudden act of sublime valour. The final achievement was the result of months of heroic, almost suicidal daring, and it was repayment of a terrible debt, the whole extent of which I knew not, owed by the man to his tormented soul. I rang up Mrs. Boyce, who replied tremulously to my congratulations. Would I come over and lunch? I found a very proud and tearful old lady. She may not have known the difference between a platoon and a howitzer, and have conceived the woolliest notions of the nature of her son's command, but the Victoria Cross was a matter on which her ideas were both definite and correct. She had spent the morning at the telephone receiving calls of congratulation. A great sheaf of telegrams had arrived. 2 or 3 of them were from the high and mighty of the military hierarchy. She was in such a twitter of joy that she almost forgot her anxiety as to his wounds. "Do you think he knows? I telegraphed to him at once." "So did I." She glanced at the ormolu clock on the mantelpiece. "How long would it take for a telegram to reach him?" "You may be sure he has it by now," said I, "and it has given him a prodigious appetite for lunch." Her face clouded over. "That horrid tin stuff. It's so dangerous. I remember once Mary's aunt, or was it Cook's aunt, one of them anyway, nearly died of eating tinned lobster. Ptomaine poisoning. I've always told Leonard not to touch it." "They don't give colonels and V.C.'s tinned lobster at Boulogne," I answered cheerfully. "He's living now on the fat of the land." "Let us hope so," she sighed dubiously. "It's no use my sending out things for him, as they always go wrong. Some time ago I sent him 3 brace of grouse and 3 brace of partridges. He didn't acknowledge them for weeks, and then he said they were most handy things to kill Germans with, but were an expensive form of ammunition. I don't quite know what he meant, but at any rate they were not eatable when they arrived." "Poor fellow," she sighed again. "If only I knew what was the matter with him." "It can't be much," I reassured her, "or you would have heard again, and this news will act like a sovereign remedy." She patted the back of my hand with her plump palm. "You're always so sympathetic and comforting." "I'm an old soldier like Leonard," said I, "and never meet trouble halfway." At lunch the old lady insisted on opening a bottle of champagne, a Veuve Clicquot which Leonard loved, in honour of the glorious occasion. We could not drink to the hero's health in any meaner vintage, although she swore that a teaspoonful meant death to her, and I protested that a confession of champagne to my medical adviser meant a dog's rating. We each, conscience bound, put up the tips of our fingers to the glasses as soon as Mary had filled them with froth, and solemnly drank the toast in the 1/8 of an inch residuum. But by some freakish chance or the other, there was nothing left in that quart bottle by the time Mary cleared the table for dessert. And to tell the honest truth, I don't think the health of either my hostess or myself was a penny the worse. Let no man despise generous wine. Treated with due reverence, it is a great loosener of human sympathy. Generous ale, similarly treated, produces the same effect. Marigold, driving me home, cocked a luminous eye on me and said, "Begging your pardon, sir, would you mind very much if I broke the neck of that there Gedge?" "You would be aiding the good cause," said I, "but I should deplore the hanging of an old friend. What has Gedge been doing?" Marigold sounded his horn and slowed down round a bend, and as soon as he got into a straight road, he replied, "I'm not going to say, sir, if I may take the liberty, that I was ever sweet on Colonel Boyce. People affect you in different ways. You either like 'em or you don't like 'em. You can't tell why. And a sergeant being, as you may say, a human being, has as much right to his private feelings regarding a colonel as any officer." "Undoubtedly," said I. "Well, sir, I never thought Colonel Boyce was true metal. But I take it all back, every bit of it." "For God's sake," I cried, stretching out a foolish but instinctive hand to the wheel, "for God's sake, control your emotions or you'll be landing us in the ditch." "That's all right, sir," he replied, steering a straight course. "She's a bit skittish at times. I was saying as how I did the Colonel an injustice. I'm very sorry. No man who wasn't steel all through ever got the V.C. They don't chuck it around on blighters." "That's all very interesting and commendable," said I, "but what has it to do with Gedge?" "He has been slandering the Colonel something dreadful the last few months, sneering at him, saying nothing definite, but insinuatingly taking away his character." "In what way?" I asked. "Well, he tells one man that the Colonel's a drunkard, another that it's women, another that he gambles and doesn't pay, another that he pays the newspapers to put in all these things about him, while all the time in France he's in a blue funk hiding in his dugout." "That's moonshine," said I. And as regards the drinking, drabbing, and gaming, of course it was. But the suggestion of cowardice gave me a sharp stab of surprise and dismay. "I know it is," said Marigold, "but the people hereabouts are so ignorant, you can make them believe anything." Marigold was a man of Kent and had a poor opinion of those born and bred in other counties. "I met Gedge this morning," he continued, and thereupon gave me the substance of the conversation. I hardly think the adjectives of the report were those that were really used. "So your precious Colonel has got the V.C.," sneered Gedge. "He has," said Marigold, "and it's too great an honour for your inconsiderable town." "If this inconsiderable town knew as much about him as I do, it would give him the order of the precious boot." "And what do you know?" asked Marigold. "That's what all you downtrodden slaves of militarism would like to find out," replied Gedge. "The time will come when I, and such as I, will tear the veils away and expose them, and say, 'These be thy gods, O Israel.'" "The time will come," retorted Marigold, "when if you don't hold your precious jaw, I, and such as I, will smash it into 1,000 pieces. For twopence I'd knock your ugly head off this present minute." Whereupon Gedge apparently wilted before the indignant eye of Sergeant Marigold and faded away down the High Street. All this in itself seemed very trivial, but for the past year the attitude of Gedge had been mysterious. Could it be possible that Gedge thought himself the sole repository of the secret which Boyce had so desperately confided to me? But when had the life of Gedge and the military life of Leonard Boyce crossed? It was puzzling. Well, to tell the truth, I thought no more about the matter. The glow of Mrs. Boyce's happiness remained with me all the evening. Rarely had I seen her so animated, so forgetful of her own ailments. She had taken the rosiest view of Leonard's physical condition, and sunned herself in the honour conferred on him by the King. I had never spent a pleasanter afternoon at her house. We had comfortably criticised our neighbours, and, laudatores temporis acti, had extolled the days of our youth. I went to bed as well pleased with life as a man can be in this convulsion of the world. The next morning she sent me a letter to read. It was written at Boyce's dictation. It ran: "Dear Mother, I'm sorry to say I am knocked out pro tem. I was fooling about where a CO didn't ought to, and a Boche bullet got me so that I can't write. But don't worry at all about me. I'm too tough for anything the Boches can do. To show how little serious it is, they tell me that I'll be conveyed to England in a day or two. So get hot water bottles and bath salts ready. Your ever-loving Leonard." This was good news. Over the telephone wire we agreed that the letter was a justification of our yesterday's little merrymaking. Obviously, I told her, he would live to fight another day. She was of opinion that he had done enough fighting already. If he went on much longer, the poor boy would get quite tired out, to say nothing of the danger of being wounded again. The King ought to let him rest on his laurels, and make others who hadn't worked a quarter as hard do the remainder of the war. "Perhaps," I said light-heartedly, "Leonard will drop the hint when he writes to thank the King for the nice cross." She said that I was laughing at her, and rang off in the best of spirits. In the evening came Betty, inviting herself to dinner. She had been on night duty at the hospital, and I had not seen her for some days. The sight of her, bright-eyed and brave, fresh and young, always filled me with happiness. I felt her presence like wine and the sea wind and the sunshine. So greatly did her vitality enrich me that sometimes I called myself a horrid old vampire. As soon as she had greeted me, she said in her downright way, "So Leonard Boyce has got his V.C." "Yes," said I. "What do you think of it?" A spot of colour rose to her cheek. "I'm very glad. It's no use, Majy, pretending that I ignore his existence. I don't and I can't. Because I loved and married someone else doesn't alter the fact that I once cared for him, does it?" "Many people," said I, judicially, "find out that they have been mistaken as to the extent and nature of their own sentiments." "I wasn't mistaken," she replied, sitting down on the piano stool, her hands on the leathern seat, her neatly shod feet stretched out in front of her, just as she had sat on her wedding eve talking nonsense to Willie Connor. "I wasn't mistaken. I was never addicted to silly schoolgirl fancies. I know my own mind. I cared a lot for Leonard Boyce." "Eh bien?" said I. "Well, don't you see what I'm driving at?" "I don't a bit." She sighed. "Oh dear, how dull some people are. Don't you see that when an affair like that is over, a woman likes to get some evidence of the man's fine qualities, in order to justify her for having once cared for him?" "Quite so. Yet—" I felt argumentative. The breach, as you know, between Betty and Boyce was wrapped in exasperating obscurity. "Yet, on the other hand," said I, "she might welcome evidence of his worthlessness, so as to justify her for having thrown him over." "If a woman isn't a damn fool already," said Betty, "and I don't think I'm one, she doesn't like to feel that she ever made a damn fool of herself. She is proud of her instincts and her judgments and the sensitive, emotional intelligence that is hers. When all these seem to have gone wrong, it's pleasing to realize that originally they went right. It soothes one's self-respect, one's pride. I know now that all these blind perceptions in me went straight to certain magnificent essentials, those that make the great, strong, fearless fighting man. That's attractive to a woman, you know. At any rate, to an independent barbarian like myself." "My dear Betty," I interrupted with a laugh, "you a barbarian? You whom I regard as the last word, the last charming and delightful word in modern womanhood?" "Of course I'm the child of my century," she cried, flushing. "I want votes, freedom, opportunity for expansion, power, everything that can develop Betty Connor into a human product worthy of the God who made her. But how she could fulfill herself without the collaboration of a man has baffled her ever since she was a girl of 16, when she began to awake to the modern movement. On one side I saw women perfectly happy in the mere savage state of wifehood and motherhood, and not caring a hang for anything else. And on the other side, women who threw babies back into limbo and preached of nothing but intellectual and political and economic independence. Oh, I worried terribly about it, Majy, when I was a girl. Each side seemed to have such a lot to say for itself. Then it dawned upon me that the only way out of the dilemma was to combine both ideals, that of the savage woman in skins and the lady professor in spectacles. That is what, allowing for the difference of sex, a man does. Why shouldn't a woman? The woman, of course, has to droop a bit more to the savage because she has to produce the babies and suckle them and so forth, and a man hasn't. That was my philosophy of life when I entered the world as a young woman. Love came into it, of course. It was a sanctification of the savagery. I've gone on like this," she laughed, "because I don't want you to protest in your dear old-fashioned way against my calling myself an independent barbarian. I am, and I glory in it. That's why, as I was saying, I'm deeply glad that Leonard Boyce has made good. His honour means a good deal to me, to my self-esteem. I hope," she added, rising and coming to me with a caressing touch, "I hope you've got the hang of the thing now." Within myself I sincerely hoped I had. If her sentiments were just as she analysed them, all was well. If, on the other hand, the little demon of love for Boyce still lurked in her heart, in spite of the marriage and widowhood, there might be trouble ahead. I remembered how once she had called him a devil. I remembered, too, uncomfortably, the scrap of conversation I had overheard between Boyce and herself in the hall. She had lashed him with her scorn, and he had taken his whipping without much show of fight. Still, a woman's love, especially that of a lady barbarian, was a curiously complex affair, and had been known to impel her to trample on a man one minute and the next to fall at his feet. Now the worm she had trampled on had turned, stood erect as a properly authenticated hero. I felt dubious as to the ensuing situation. "I wrote to old Mrs. Boyce," she added after a while. "I thought it only decent. I wrote yesterday, but only posted the letter today, so as to be sure I wasn't acting on impulse." The latter part of the remark was by way of apology. The breach of the engagement had occasioned a cessation of social relations between Betty and Mrs. Boyce. Betty's aunts had ceased calling on Mrs. Boyce, and Mrs. Boyce had ceased calling on Betty's aunts. Whenever the estranged parties met, which now and then was inevitable in a little town, they bowed with distant politeness, but exchanged no words. Everything was conducted with complete propriety. The old lady, knowing how beloved and intimate of mine was Betty, alluded but once to the broken engagement. That was when Betty got married. "It has been a great unhappiness to me, Major," she said. "In spite of her daring ways, which an old woman like myself can't quite understand, I was very fond of her. She was just the girl for Leonard. They made such a handsome couple. I have never known why it was broken off. Leonard won't tell me. It's out of the question that it could be his fault, and I can't believe it is all Betty Fairfax's. She's a girl of too much character to be a mere jilt." I remember that I couldn't help smiling at the application of the old-fashioned word to my Betty. "You may be quite certain she isn't that," said I. "Then what was the reason? Do you know?" I didn't. I was as mystified as herself. I told her so. I didn't mention that a few days before she had implied that Leonard was a devil, and she wished that he was dead, thereby proving to me, who knew Betty's uprightness, that Boyce, and Boyce only, was to blame in the matter. It would have been a breach of confidence, and it would not have made my old friend any the happier. It would have fired her with flaming indignation against Betty. "Young people," said I, "must arrange their own lives." And we left it at that. Now and then, afterwards, she inquired politely after Betty's health, and when Willie Connor was killed, she spoke to me very feelingly and begged me to convey to Betty the expression of her deep sympathy. In the unhappy circumstances, she explained, she was naturally precluded from writing. So Betty's letter was the first direct communication that had passed between them for nearly 2 years. That is why to my meddlesome mind itself it appeared to have some significance. "You did you?" said I. Then I looked at her quickly with an idea in my head. "What did Mrs. Boyce say in reply?" "She has had no time to answer. Didn't I tell you I only posted the letter today?" "Then you've heard nothing more about Leonard Boyce, except that he has got the V.C.?" "No. What more is there to hear?" Even Bettys are sly folk. It behooved me to counter with equal slyness. I wondered whether she had known all along of Boyce's mishap, or had been informed of it by his mother. Knowledge might explain her unwonted outburst. I looked at her fixedly. "What's the matter?" she asked, bending slightly down to me. "You haven't heard that he is wounded?" She straightened herself. "No. When?" "5 days ago." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I haven't seen you. I mean this evening." I reached for her hand. "Will you forgive me, my dear Betty, for remarking that for the last 20 minutes you have done all the talking?" "Is he badly hurt?" She ignored my playful rejoinder. I noted the fact. Usually she was quick to play Beatrice to my Benedick. Had I caught her off her guard? I told her all that I knew. She seated herself again on the piano stool. "I hope Mrs. Boyce did not think me unfeeling for not referring to it," she said calmly. "You will explain, won't you?" Marigold entered, announcing dinner. We went into the dining room. All through the meal Bella, my parlour maid, flitted about with dishes and plates, and Marigold, when he was not solemnly pouring claret, stood grim behind my chair, roasting, as usual, his posterior before a blazing fire, with soldierly devotion to duty. Conversation fell a little flat. The arrival of the evening newspapers, half an hour belated, created a diversion. The war is sometimes subversive of nice table decorum. I read out the cream of the news. Discussion thereon lasted us until coffee and cigarettes were brought in, and the servants left us to ourselves. One of the curious little phenomena of human intercourse is the fact that now and again the outer personality of one with whom you are daily familiar suddenly strikes you afresh, thus printing, as it were, a new portrait on your mind. At varying intervals I had received such portrait impressions of Betty, and I had stored them in my memory. Another I received at this moment, and it is among the most delectable. She was sitting with both elbows on the table, her palms clasped, and her cheek resting on the back of the left hand. Her face was turned towards me. She wore a low-cut black chiffon evening dress. The thing had mere straps over the shoulders, an all but discarded vanity of pre-war days. I had never before noticed what beautiful arms she had. Perhaps in her girlhood, when I had often seen her in such exiguous finery, they had not been so shapely. I have told you already of the softening touch of her womanhood. An exquisite curve from arm to neck faded into the shadow of her hair. She had a single string of pearls round her neck. The fatigue of last week's night duty had cast an added spirituality over her frank, sensitive face. We had not spoken for a while. She smiled at me. "What are you thinking of?" "I wasn't thinking at all," said I. "I was only gratefully admiring you." "Why gratefully?" Oughtn't one to be grateful to God for the beautiful things He gives us?" She flushed and averted her eyes. "You are very good to me, Meiji." "What made you attire yourself in all this splendor?" I asked, laughing. "The wise man does not carry sentiment too far. He keeps it like a little precious nugget of pure gold. The less wise beats it out into a flabby film." "I don't know," she said, shifting her position and casting a critical glance at her bodice. "All kinds of funny little feminine vanities. Perhaps I wanted to see whether I hadn't gone off. Perhaps I wanted to try to feel good looking, even if I wasn't. Perhaps I thought my dear old Meiji was sick to death of the hospital uniform perfumed with disinfectant. Perhaps it was just a cat-like longing for comfort. Anyhow, I'm glad you like me." "My dear Betty," said I adore you." "And I you," she laughed. "So there's a pair of us." She lit a cigarette and sipped her coffee. Then, breaking a short silence, "I hope you quite understand, dear, what I said about Leonard Boyce. I shouldn't like to leave you with the smallest little bit of a wrong impression." "What wrong impression could I possibly have?" I asked disingenuously. "You might think that I was still in love with him." "That would be absurd," said I. "Utterly absurd. I should feel it to be almost an insult if you thought anything of the kind. Long before my marriage, things that had happened had killed all such feelings outright." She paused for a few seconds and her brow darkened, just as it had done when she had spoken of him in the days immediately preceding her marriage with Willie Connor. Presently it cleared. "The whole beginning and end of my present feelings," she continued, "is that I'm glad the man I once cared for has won such high distinction, and I'm sorry that such a brave soldier should be wounded." I could do nothing else than assure her of my perfect understanding. I upbraided myself as a monster of indelicacy for my touch of doubt before dinner. Also for a devilish and malicious suspicion that flitted through my brain while she was cataloguing her possible reasons for putting on the old evening dress. The thought of Betty's beautiful arm and the man's bull neck was a shivering offence. I craved purification. "If you've finished your coffee," I said, "let us go into the drawing room and have some music." She rose with the impulsiveness of a child told that it can be excused, and responded startlingly to my thought. "I think we need it," she said. In the drawing room I swung my chair so that I could watch her hands on the keys. She was a good musician and had the well-taught executant's certainty and grace of movement. It may be the fancy of an outer Philistine, but I loved to forget the existence of the instrument and to feel the music coming from the human fingertips. She found a volume of Chopin's Nocturnes on the rest. In fact, she had left it there a fortnight before, the last time she had played for me. I am very fond of Chopin. I am an uneducated fellow, and the lyrical mostly appeals to me both in poetry and in music. Besides, I have understood him better since I have been a crock. And I loved Betty's sympathetic interpretation. So I sat there, listening and watching, and I knew that she was playing for the ease of both our souls. Once more I thanked God for the great gift of Betty to my crippled life. Peace gathered round my heart as Betty played. The raucous buzz of the telephone in the corner of the room knocked the music to shatters. I cried out impatiently. It was the fault of that giant of ineptitude Marigold and his incompetent satellites, whose duty it was to keep all upstairs extensions turned off and receive calls below. Only 2 months before I had been the victim of their culpable neglect, when I was forced to have an altercation with a man at Harrod's Stores, who seemed pained because I declined to take an interest in some idiotic remark he was making about fish. "I'll strangle Marigold with my own hands," I cried. Betty, unmoved by my ferocity, laughed and rose from the piano. "Shall I take the call?" To Betty I was all urbanity. "If you'll be so kind, dear," said I. She crossed the room and stopped the abominable buzzing. "Yes. Hold on for a minute. It's the post office," she turned to me, "telephoning a telegram that has just come in. Shall I take it down for you?" More urbanity on my part. She found pencil and paper on an escritoire near by and went back to the instrument. For a while she listened and wrote. At last she said, "Are you sure there's no signature?" She got the reply, waited until the message had been read over, and hung up the receiver. When she came round to me, my back had been half turned to her all the time, I was astonished to see her looking rather shaken. She handed me the paper without a word. The message ran, "Thanks yesterday's telegram. Just got home. Queen Victoria Hospital, Belton Square. Must have talk with you before I communicate with my mother. Rely absolutely on your discretion. Come tomorrow. Forgive inconvenience caused, but most urgent." "It's from Boyce," I said, looking up at her. "Naturally. I suppose he omitted the signature to avoid any possible leakage through the post office here." She nodded. What do you think is the matter?" "God knows," said I. "Evidently something very serious." She went back to the piano seat. "It's odd that I should have taken down that message," she said after a while. "I'll sack Marigold for putting you in that abominable position," I exclaimed wrathfully. "No, you won't, dear. What does it signify? I'm not a silly child. I suppose you're going tomorrow?" "Of course. For Mrs. Boyce's sake alone, I should have no alternative." She turned round and began to take up the thread of the nocturne from the point where she had left off, but she only played half a page and quitted the piano abruptly. The pretty little spell is broken, Majy. No matter how we try to escape from the war, it is always shrieking in upon us. We're up against naked facts all the time. If we can't face them, we go under, either physically or spiritually. Anyhow," she smiled with just a little touch of weariness, "we may as well face them in comfort." She pushed my chair gently nearer to the fire and sat down by my side. And there we remained in intimate silence until Marigold announced the arrival of her car. End of chapter 17. Recording by Sean Michael Hogan, St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada. Chapter 18 of The Red Planet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sean Michael Hogan. The Red Planet by William J. Locke. Chapter 18. I shrink morbidly from visiting strange houses. I shrink from the unknown discomforts and trivial humiliations they may hold for me. I hate, for instance, not to know what kind of a chair may be provided for me to sit on. I hate to be carried up many stairs, even by my steel crane of a Marigold. Just try doing without your legs for a couple of days, and you will see what I mean. Of course I despise myself for such nervous apprehensions, and do not allow them to influence my actions, just as one under heavy fire does not satisfy one's simple yearning to run away. I would have given a year's income to be able to refuse Boyce's request with a clear conscience, but I could not. I shrank all the more because my visit in the autumn to Reggie Dacre had shaken me more than I cared to confess. It had been the only occasion for years when I had entered a London building other than my club. To the club, where I was as much at home as in my own house, all those in town with whom I now and then had to transact business were good enough to come. This penetration of strange hospitals was an agitating adventure. Apart, however, from the mere physical nervousness against which, as I say, I fought, there was another element in my feelings with regard to Boyce's summons. If I talk about the iron hand of fate, you may think I am using a cliché of melodrama. Perhaps I am, but it expresses what I mean. Something unregenerate in me, some lingering atavistic savage instinct towards freedom, rebelled against this same iron hand of fate that, first clapping me on the shoulder long ago in Cape Town, was now dragging me against my will into ever-thickening entanglement with the dark and crooked destiny of Leonard Boyce. I tell you all this because I don't want to pose as a kind of apodal angel of mercy. I was also deadly anxious as to the nature of the communication Boyce would make to me before his mother should be informed of his arrival in London. In spite of his frank confession, there was still such a cloud of mystery over the man's soul as to render any revelation possible. Had his hurt declared itself to be a mortal one? Had he summoned me to unburden his conscience while yet there was time? Was it going to be a repetition, with a difference, of my last interview with Reggie Dacre? I worried myself with unnecessary conjecture. After a miserable drive through February rain and slush, I reached my destination in Belton Square, a large mansion, presumably equipped by its owner as a hospital for officers and given over to the nation. A telephone message had prepared the authorities for my arrival. Marigold, preceded by the sister in charge, carried me across a tessellated hall and began to ascend the broad staircase. I uttered a little gasp and looked around me, for in a flash I realized where I was. 20 years ago I had danced in this house. I had danced here with my wife before we were married. On the half landing we had sat out together. It was the town house of the late Lord Madelloe, with whose wife I shared the acquaintance of a couple of hundred young dancing men inscribed on her party list. Both were dead long since. To whom the house belonged now I did not know, but I recognized pictures and statuary and a conservatory with palms. And the place shimmered with brilliant ghosts and was haunted by hot perfumes and by the echo of human voices and by elfin music. and the cripple forgot that he was being carried up the stairs in the grip of the old soldier. He was mounting them with heart beating high and the presence of a beloved hand on his arm. You see, it was all so sudden. It took my breath away and sent my mind whirling back over 20 years. It was like awakening from a dream to find a door flung open in front of me and to hear the sister announce my name. I was on the threshold not of a ward, but of a well-appointed private room fairly high up and facing the square, for the first thing I saw was the tops of the leafless trees through the windows. Then I was conscious of a cheery fire. The last thing I took in was the bed running at right angles to door and window, and Leonard Boyce lying in it with bandages about his face. For the dazed second or two he seemed to be Reggie Dacre over again. But he had thrown back the bedclothes and his broad chest and great arms were free. His pleasant voice rang out at once. "Hello, hello! You are a good Samaritan. Is that you, Marigold? There's a comfortable chair by the bedside for Major Meredith." He seemed remarkably strong and hearty, far from any danger of death. Stubs of cigarettes were lying in an ashtray on the bed. In a moment or two they settled me down and left me alone with him. As soon as he heard the click of the door, he said, "I've done more than I set out to do. You remember our conversation. I said I should either get the V.C. or never see you again. I've managed both." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I shall never see you or anybody else again, or a dog or a cat, or a tree or a flower." Then for the first time the dreadful truth broke upon me. "Good heavens!" I cried. "Your eyes?" "Done in. Blind. It's a bit ironical, isn't it?" He laughed bitterly. What I said by way of sympathy and consolation is neither here nor there. I spoke sincerely from my heart, for I felt overwhelmed by the tragedy of it all. He stretched out his hand and grasped mine. "I knew you wouldn't fail me. Your sort never does. You understand now why I wanted you to come? To prepare the old mother for the shock. You've seen for yourself that I'm sound of wind and limb, as fit as a fiddle. You can make it quite clear to her that I'm not going to die yet awhile, and you can let her down easy on the real matter. Tell her I'm as merry as possible and looking forward to going about Wellingsford with a dog and string." "You're a brave chap, Boyce," I said. He laughed again. "You're anticipating. Do you remember what I said when you asked me what I should do if I won all the pots I set my heart on and came through alive? I said I should begin to try to be a brave man. God, it's a tough proposition, but it's something to live for anyway." I asked him how it happened. "I got sick," he replied, "of bearing a charmed life and nothing happening. The Boche shell or bullet that could hit me wasn't made. I could stroll about freely where it was death for anyone else to show the top of his head. I didn't care. Then suddenly one day things went wrong. You know what I mean. I nearly let my regiment down. It was touch and go. And it was touch and go with my career. I just pulled through, however. I'll tell you all about it one of these days, if you'll put up with me." Again the familiar twitch of the lips which looked ghastly below the bandaged eyes. No one ever dreamed of the hell I went through. Then I found I was losing the nerve I had built up all these months. I nearly went off my head. At last I thought I would put an end to it. It was a small attack of ours that had failed. The men poured back over the parapet into the trench, leaving heaven knows how many dead and wounded outside. I'm not superstitious, and I don't believe in premonitions and warnings and so forth. But in cases of waiting like mine, a man suddenly gets to know that his hour has come. I got in 6 wounded. 2 men were shot while I was carrying them. How I lived, God knows. It was cold hell. My clothes were torn to rags. As I was going for the 7th, the knob of my life preserver was shot away, and my wrist nearly broken. I wore it with a strap, you know. The infernal thing had been a kind of mascot. When I realized it was gone, I just stood still and shivering in a sudden, helpless funk. The 7th man was crawling up to me. He had a bloody face and one dragging leg. That's my last picture of God's earth. Before I could do anything, I must have been standing sideways on, a bullet got me across the bridge of the nose, and night came down like a black curtain. Then I ran like a hare. Sometimes I tripped over a man, dead or wounded, and fell on my head. I don't remember much about this part of it. They told me afterwards. At last I stumbled onto the parapet and some plucky fellow got me into the trench. It was the regulation V.C. business, he added, and so they gave it to me. "Specially," said I. "Consolation prize, I suppose, for losing my sight. They had just time to get me away behind when the Germans counterattacked. If I hadn't brought the 6 men in, they wouldn't have had a dog's chance. I did save their lives. That's something to the credit side of the infernal balance." "There can be no balance now, my dear chap," said I. "God knows you've paid in full." He lifted his hand and dropped it with a despairing gesture. "There's only one payment in full. That was denied me. God, or whoever was responsible, had my eyes knocked out and made it impossible forever. He or somebody must be enjoying the farce." "That's all very well," said I. "A man can do no more than his utmost, as you've done. He must be content to leave the rest in the hands of the Almighty." "The Almighty has got a down on me," he replied, "and I don't blame him. Of course, from your point of view, you're right. You're a normal, honourable soldier and gentleman. Anything you've got to reproach yourself with is of very little importance. But I'm an accursed freak. I told you all about it when you held me up over the South African affair. There were other affairs after that, others again in this war. Haven't I just told you I let my regiment down?" "Don't, my dear man, don't!" I cried in great pain, for it was horrible to hear a man talk like this. "Can't you see you've wiped out everything?" "There's one thing at any rate I can't ever wipe out," he said in a low voice. Then he laughed. "I've got to stick it. It may be amusing to see how it all pans out. I suppose the very last passion left us is curiosity." "There's also the unconquerable soul," said I. "You're very comforting," said he. "If I were in your place, I'd leave a chap like me to the worms." He drew a long breath. "I suppose I'll pull through all right." "Of course you will," said I. "I feel tons better, thanks to you, already." "That's right," said I. He fumbled for the box of cigarettes on the bed. Instinctively I tried to help him, but I was tied to my fixed chair. It was a trivial occasion, but I have never been so terrified by the sense of helplessness. Just think of it. Two men of clear brain, and to all intents and purposes of sound bodily health, unable to reach an object a few feet away. Boyce uttered an impatient exclamation. "Get hold of that box for me, like a good chap," he said, his fingers groping wide of the mark. "I can't move," said I. "Good Lord, I forgot." He began to laugh. I laughed too. We laughed like fools and the tears ran down my cheeks. I suppose we were on the verge of hysterics. I pulled myself together and gave him a cigarette from my case, and then, stretch as I would, I could not reach far enough to apply the match to the end of the cigarette between his lips. He was unable to lift his head. I lit another match and, like an idiot, put it between his fingers. He nearly burned his moustache in his bandage, and would have burned his fingers had not the match, a wooden one, providentially gone out. Then I lit a cigarette myself and handed it to him. The incident, as I say, was trivial, but it had deep symbolic significance. All symbols in their literal objectivity are trivial. What more trivial than the eating of a bit of bread and the sipping from a cup of wine? This trumpery business with the cigarette revolutionized my whole feelings towards Boyce. It initiated us into a sacred brotherhood. Hitherto, it had been his nature which had reached out towards me tentacles of despair. My inner self, as I have tried to show you, had never responded. It was restrained by all kinds of doubts, suspicions, and repulsions. Now, suddenly, it broke through all those barriers and rushed forth to meet him. My death in life, against which I had fought, I hope like a brave man, it takes a bit of fighting, for many years, would henceforth be his death in life, at whose terrors he too would have to snap a disdainful finger. I had felt deep pity for him, but if pity is indeed akin to love, it is a very poor relation. Now I had cast pity and such like superior sentiment aside, and accepted him as a sworn brother. The sins, whatever they were, that lay on the man's conscience mattered nothing. He had paid in splendid penance and in terrible penalty. I should have liked to express to him something of this surge of emotion, but I could find no words. As a race, our emotions are not facile, and therefore we lack the necessary practice in expressing them. When they do come, they come all of a heap, and scare us out of our wits and leave us speechless. So the immediate outcome of all this psychological upheaval was that we went on smoking, and said nothing more about it. As far as I remember, we started talking about the recruiting muddle, as to which our views most vigorously coincided. We parted cheerily. It was only when I got outside the room that the ghastly irony of the situation again made my heart as lead. We passed by the conservatory and the statuary and down the great staircase, but the ghosts had gone. Yet I cast a wistful glance at the spot. It was just under that coip with the flashing white horse, where we had sat 20 years ago. But the new tragedy had rendered the memory less poignant. "It's a dreadful thing about the Colonel, sir," said Marigold as we drove off. "More dreadful than anyone can imagine," said I. "What's he going to do with himself is what I'm wondering," said Marigold. What indeed? The question went infinitely deeper than the practical dreams of Marigold's philosophy. My honest fellow saw but the outside. the full-blooded man of action cabined in his lifelong darkness. I, to whom chance had revealed more, trembled at the contemplation of his future. The man, goaded by the Furies, had rushed into the jaws of death. Those jaws, by some divine ordinance, had ruthlessly closed against him. The Furies, meanwhile, attended him unrelenting. Whither now would they goad him? Into madness? I doubted it. In spite of his contradictory nature, he did not seem to be the sort of man who would go mad. He could exercise over himself too reasoned a control. Yet here were passions and despairs seething without an outlet. What would be the end? It is true that he had achieved glory. To the end of his life, wherever he went, he would command the honour and admiration of men. Greater achievement is granted to few mortals. In our little town he would be the great hero. But would all that human sympathy and veneration could contrive keep the Furies at bay and soothe the tormented spirit? I tried to eat a meal at the club, but the food choked me. I got into the car as soon as possible and reached Wellingsford with head and heart racked with pain. But before I could go home, I had to execute Boyce's mission. If I accomplished it successfully, my heart, and not my wearied mind, deserves the credit. At first Mrs. Boyce broke down under the shock of the news, for all the preparations in the world can do little to soften a deadly blow. But breed and pride soon asserted themselves, and she faced things bravely. With charming dignity she received Marigold's few respectful words of condolence, and she thanked me for what I had done, beyond my deserts. To show how brave she was, she insisted on accompanying us downstairs, and on standing in the bleak evening air while Marigold put me in the car. After all, I have my son alive, and in good strong health. I must realize how merciful God has been to me. She put her hand into mine. I shan't see you again till I bring him home with me. I shall go up to London early tomorrow morning and stay with my old friend Lady Fanshawe. I think you have met her here, the widow of the late Admiral Fanshawe. She has a house in Eccleston Street, which I think is in the neighbourhood of Belton Square. If I haven't thanked you enough, dear Major Meredith, it is that, when one's heart is full, one can't do everything all at once. She waved to me very graciously as the car drove off, a true Spartian mother, dear lady, of our modern England. Oh, the humiliation of possessing a frail body and a lot of disorganized nerves. When I got home, Marigold, seeing that I was overtired, was all for putting me to bed then and there. I spurned the insulting proposal in language plain enough even to his wooden understanding. Sometimes his imperturbability exasperated me. I might just as well try to taunt a poker or sting a fire shovel into resentment of personal abuse. "I'll see you hanged, drawn, and quartered before I'll go to bed," I declared. "Very good, sir." The gaunt wretch was carrying me. "But I think you might lie down for half an hour before dinner." He deposited me ignominiously on the bed and left the room. In about 10 minutes, Dr. Cliffe, my inveterate adversary who has kept life in me for many a year, came in with his confounded pink smiling face. "What's this I hear? Been overdoing it?" "What the deuce are you doing here?" I cried. "Go away. How dare you come when you're not wanted?" He grinned. "I'm wanted right enough, old man. The good Marigold's never at fault. He rang me up and I slipped round at once." "One of these days," said I, "I'll murder that fellow." He replied by gagging me with his beastly thermometer. Then he felt my pulse and listened to my heart and stuck his fingers into the corners of my eyes so as to look at the whites. And when he was quite satisfied with himself, there is only one animal more self-complacent than your medical man in such circumstances, and that is a dog who has gorged himself with surreptitious meat. He ordained that I should forthwith go properly to bed and stay there and be perfectly quiet until he came again, and in the meanwhile swallow some filthy medicine which he would send round. "One of these days," said he rebukingly, "instead of murdering your devoted sergeant, you'll be murdering yourself, if you go on such lunatic excursions. Of course I'm shocked at hearing about Colonel Boyce, and I'm sorry for the poor lady, but why you should have been made to half kill yourself over the matter is more than I can understand." "I happen," said I, "to be his only intimate friend in the place." "You happen," he retorted, "to be a chronic invalid in the most infernal worry of my life." "You're nothing but an overbearing bully," said I. He grinned again. "That is what I have to put up with. If I curse Marigold, he takes no notice. If I curse Cliffe, he grins. Yet what I should do without them, heaven only knows." "God bless 'em both," said I, when my aching body was between the cool sheets. Although it was none of his duties, Marigold brought me in a light supper, fish and a glass of champagne. Never a parlour maid would he allow to approach me when I was unwell. I often wondered what would happen if I were really ill and required the attendance of a nurse. I swear no nurse's touch could be so gentle as when he raised me on the pillows. He bent over the tray on the table by the bed and began to dissect out the backbone of the soul. "I can do that," said I, fretfully. He cocked a solitary, reproachful eye on me. I burst out laughing. He looked so dear and ridiculous with his preposterous curly wig and his battered face. He went on with his task. "I wonder, Marigold," said I, "how you put up with me." He did not reply until he had placed the neatly arranged tray across my body. "I've never heard, sir," said he, "as how a man couldn't put up with his blessings." A bit of sole was on my fork and I was about to convey it to my mouth, but there came a sudden lump in my throat and I put the fork down. "But what about the curses?" A horrible contortion of the face and a guttural rumble indicated amusement on the part of Marigold. I stared, very serious, having been profoundly touched. "What are you laughing at?" I asked. The idiot's merriment increased in vehemence. He said, "You're too funny, sir," and just bolted, in a manner unbecoming not only to a sergeant, but even to a butler. As I mused on this unprecedented occurrence, I made a discovery, that of Sergeant Marigold's sense of humour. To that sense of humour my upbraidings often, I must confess, couched in picturesque and figurative terms so as not too greatly to hurt his feelings, had made constant appeal for the past 15 years. Hitherto he had hidden all signs of humorous titillation behind his impassive mask. To-night a spark of sentiment had been the match to explode the mine of his mirth. It was a serious position. Here had I been wasting on him half a lifetime's choicest objurgations. What was I to do in the future to consolidate my authority? I never enjoyed a fried sole and a glass of champagne more in my life. He came in later to remove the tray, as wooden as ever. "Mrs. Connor called a little while ago, sir." "Why didn't you ask her to come in to see me?" "Doctor's orders, sir." After the sole and champagne I felt much better. I should have welcomed my dear Betty with delight. That, at any rate, was my first impulsive thought. "Confound the doctor!" I cried. And I was going to confound Marigold too, but I caught his steady luminous eye. What was the use of any anathema when he would only take it away as a dog does a bone, and enjoy it in a solitary corner? I recovered myself. "Well," said I with dignity, "did Mrs. Connor leave any message?" "I was to give you her compliments, sir, and say she was sorry you were so unwell, and she was shocked to hear of Colonel Boyce's sad affliction." This was sheer orderly room. Such an expression as sad affliction never passed Betty's lips. I, however, had nothing to say. Marigold settled me for the night and left me. When I was alone, unable to consider the point, I felt a cowardly gratitude towards the doctor who had put me to bed like a sick man and forbidden access to my room. I had been spared breaking the news to Betty. How she received it, I did not know. It had been impossible to question Marigold. After all, it was a matter of no essential moment. I consoled myself with the reflection and tried to go to sleep. But I passed a wretched night, my head whirling with the day's happenings. The morning papers showed me that Boyce, wishing to spare his mother, had been wise to summon me at once. They all published an official paragraph describing the act for which he had received his distinction, and announcing the facts of his blindness. They also gave a brief and flattering sketch of his career. One paper devoted to him a short leading article. The illustrated papers published his photograph. Boyce was on the road to becoming a popular hero. Cliff kept me in bed all that day, to my great irritation. I had no converse with the outside world, save vicariously with Betty, who rang up to inquire after my health. On the following morning, when I drove abroad with Hosea, I found the whole town ringing with Boyce. It was a Friday, the day of publication of the local newspaper. It had run to extravagant bills all over the place. "Wellingsford hero honoured by the King. Tragic end to glorious deeds." The word, Marigold's I suppose, had gone round that I had visited the hero in London. I was stopped half a dozen times on my way up the High Street by folks eager for personal details. Outside Prettylove the hairdresser's I held quite a little reception, and instead of moving me on for blocking the traffic, as any of his London colleagues would have done, the local police sergeant sank his authority and by the side of a butcher's boy formed part of the assembly. When I got to the Market Square, I saw Sir Anthony Fenimore's car standing outside the town hall. The chauffeur stopped me. "Sir Anthony was going to call on you, sir, as soon as he had finished his business inside." "I'll wait for him," I said. It was one of the few mild days of a wretched month, and I enjoyed the air. Springfield, the house agent, passed and engaged me in conversation on the absorbing topic, and then the manager of the gas works joined us. Everyone listened so reverently to my utterances that I began to feel as if I had won the Victoria Cross myself. Presently Sir Anthony bustled out of the town hall, pink, brisk, full of business. At the august appearance of the mayor, my less civically distinguished friends departed. His eyes brightened as they fell on me, and he shook hands vigorously. "My dear Duncan, I was just on my way to you. Only heard this morning that you've been seedy. Knocked up, I suppose, by your journey to town. Just heard of that, too. Must have thought me a brute not to inquire. But Edith and I didn't know. I was away all yesterday. These infernal tribunals. With that example of men like Leonard Boyce before their eyes, it makes one sick to look at able-bodied young Englishmen trying to wriggle out of their duty to the country. Well, dear old chap, how are you?" I assured him that I had recovered from Cliff and was in my usual state of health. He rubbed his hands. "That's good. Now give me all the news. What is Boyce's condition? When will he be able to be moved? When do you think he'll come back to Wellingsford?" At this series of questions I pricked a curious ear. "Am I speaking to the man or the mayor?" "The mayor," said he. "I wish to goodness I could get you inside, so that you and I and Winterbotham could talk things over." Winterbotham was the town clerk. Sir Anthony cast an instinctive glance at his chauffeur, a little withered elderly man. I laughed and made a sign of dissent. When you have to be carried about, you shy at the prospect of little withered elderly men as carriers. Besides, unless it would lower Winterbotham's dignity or give him a cold in the head, said I, why shouldn't he come out here? Sir Anthony crossed the pavement briskly, gave a message to the doorkeeper of the town hall, and returned to Hosea and myself. "It's a dreadful thing, dreadful. I never realized till today, when I read his record, what a distinguished soldier he was. A modern Bayard. For the last year or so he seemed to put my back up. Behaved in rather a curious way, never came near the house where once he was always welcome, and when I asked him to dinner he turned me down flat. But that's all over. Sometimes one has these pettifogging personal vanities. The best thing is to be heartily ashamed of 'em like an honest man, and throw 'em out in the dung heap where they belong. That's what I told Edith last night, and she agreed with me. Don't you?" I smiled. Here was another typical English gentleman ridding his conscience of an injustice done to Leonard Boyce. "Of course I do," said I. "Boyce is a queer fellow. A man with his exceptional qualities has to be judged in an exceptional way." "And then," said Sir Anthony, "it's that poor dear old lady that I've been thinking of. Edith went to see her yesterday afternoon, but found she had gone up to London. In her frail health, it's enough to kill her." "It won't," said I. "A woman doesn't give birth to a lion without having something of the lion in her nature." "I've never thought of that," said Sir Anthony. "Haven't you?" His face turned grave, and he looked far away over the red brick post office on the opposite side of the square. Then he sighed, looked at me with a smile, and nodded. "You're right, Duncan." "I know I am," said I. "I broke the news to Mrs. Boyce. That's why he asked me to go up and see him." Winterbotham appeared, a tall, cadaverous man in a fur coat and a soft felt hat. He shook hands with me in a melancholy way. In a humbler walk of life, I am sure he would have been an undertaker. "Now," said Sir Anthony, "tell us all about your interview with Boyce." "Before I commit myself," said I, "with the civic authorities, will you kindly inform me what this conference coram publico is all about?" "Why, my dear chap, haven't I told you?" cried Sir Anthony. "We're going to give Colonel Boyce a civic reception." End of chapter 18. Recording by Sean Michael Hogan, St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada.
Chapter 19, Part 1 of The Red Planet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Red Planet by William J. Locke. Chapter 19, Part 1. Thenceforward nothing was talked of but the homecoming of Colonel Boyce. He touched the public imagination. All kinds of stories, some apocryphal, some having a basis of truth, some authentic, went the round of the little place. It simmered with martial fervor. Elderly laggards enrolled themselves in the volunteer training corps. Young married men who had not attested under the Derby scheme rushed out to enlist. The tribunal languished in idleness for lack of claimants for exemption. Exempted men, with the enthusiastic backing of employers, lost the sense of their indispensability and joined the colors. An energetic lady who had met the Serbian minister in London conceived the happy idea of organizing a Serbian Flag Day in Wellingsford, and reaped a prodigious harvest. We were all tremendously patriotic, living under Boyce's reflected glory. At first I had deprecated the proposal, fearing lest Boyce might not find it acceptable. The reputation he had sought at the cannon's mouth was a bubble of a different kind from that which the good townsfolk were eager to celebrate. Vanity had no part in it. For what the outer world thought of his exploits he did not care a penny. He was past caring. His soul alone, for its own sore needs, had driven him to the search. Before his own soul, and not before his fellow countrymen, had he craved to parade as a recipient of the Victoria Cross. His own soul, as I knew, not being satisfied, he would shrink from obtaining popular applause under false pretences. No unhappy man ever took sterner measure of himself. Of all this no one but myself had the faintest idea. In explaining my opinion, I had to leave out all essentials. I could only hint that a sensitive man like Colonel Boyce might be averse from exhibiting in public his physical disabilities; that he had always shown himself a modest soldier with a dislike of self-advertisement; that he would prefer to seek immediate refuge in the quietude of his home. But they would not listen to me. Colonel Boyce, they said, would be too patriotic to refuse the town's recognition. It was part of the game which he, as a brave soldier, no matter how modest, could not fail to play. He would recognize that such public honourings of valour had widespread effect among the population. In face of such arguments I had to withdraw my opposition; otherwise it might have appeared that I was actuated by petty personal motives. God knows I only desired to save Boyce from undergoing a difficult ordeal. For the same reasons I could not refuse to serve on the reception committee, which was immediately formed under the chairmanship of the Mayor. Preliminaries having been discussed, the Mayor and the Town Clerk waited on Boyce in Belton Square, and returned with the triumphant tidings that they had succeeded in their mission. "I can't make out what you were running your head against, Duncan," said Sir Anthony. "Of course, as you say, he's a modest chap and dislikes publicity. So do we all. But I quickly talked him out of that objection. I talked him out of all sorts of objections before he could raise them. At last, what do you think he said?" "I should have told you to go to blazes and not worry me." "He didn't. He said, now I like the chap for it, it was so simple and honest. He said, 'If I were alone in the world I wouldn't have it, for I don't like it. But I'll accept on one condition. My poor old mother has had rather a thin time, and she's going to have a thinner. She never gets a look in. Make it as far as possible her show, and I'll do what you like.' What do you think of that?" "I think it's very characteristic," said I. And it was. In my mental survey of the situation from Boyce's point of view, I had not taken into account the best and finest in the man. His reason rang true against my exceptional knowledge of him. I had worked myself into so sympathetic a comprehension that I knew he would be facing something unknown and terrible in the proposed ceremony. I knew that for his own sake he would have unequivocally declined. But ad majorem matris gloriam he assented. The main question, at any rate, was settled. The hero would accept the honour. It was for the committee to make the necessary arrangements. We corresponded far and wide in order to obtain municipal precedence. We had interviews with the military and railway authorities. We were in constant communication with the local volunteer training corps, with the Godbury Volunteers and the Godbury School O.T.C., who both desired to take a part in the great event. In compliance with the conditions imposed, we gave as much publicity as we could to Mrs. Boyce. Lieutenant Colonel Boyce, V.C., and Mrs. Boyce were officially associated in the programme of the reception. How to disentangle them afterwards, when the presentation of the address, engrossed on velluni and enclosed in a casket, should be made to the Colonel, was the subject of heated and confused discussion. Then the feminine elements in town and county desired to rally to the side of Mrs. Boyce. The Red Cross and Volunteer Aid Detachment nurses claimed representation. So did the munitions workers of Godbury. The Countess of Laleham, the wife of the Lord Lieutenant of the county, a most imposing and masterful woman, signified in genteel though incisive language her intention to take a leading part in the proceedings, and to bring along her husband, apparently as an unofficial ornament. This, of course, upset our plans, which had all to be reconsidered from the beginning. "Who is giving the reception?" cried Lady Fenimore, who could stand upon her dignity as well as anybody. "The county or Wellingsford? I presume it's Wellingsford, and so long as I am Mayoress that dreadful Laleham woman will have to take a back seat." So you see we had our hands full. All this time I found Betty curiously elusive. Now and then I met her for a few fugitive moments at the hospital. Twice she ran in for dinner, in uniform, desperately busy, arriving on the stroke of the dinner hour and rushing away 5 minutes after her coffee and cigarette, alleging as excuse the epidemic of influenza, consequent on the vile weather, which had woefully reduced the hospital staff. She seemed to be feverish and ill at ease, and tried to cover the symptoms by a reversion to her old offhand manner. As I was so seldom alone with her, I could find scant opportunity for intimate conversation. I thought that she might have regretted the frank exposition of her feelings regarding Leonard Boyce, but she showed no sign of it. She spoke in the most detached way of his blindness and the coming ceremony. Never once, even on the first occasion when I met her in the hospital corridor, after my return from London, did her attitude vary from that of any kind-hearted Englishwoman who deplores the mutilation of a gallant social acquaintance. Sometimes I wanted to shake her, though I could scarcely tell why. I certainly would not have had her weep on my shoulder over Boyce's misfortune, nor would I have cared for her to exhibit a vindictive callousness. She behaved with perfect propriety. Perhaps that is what disturbed me. I was not accustomed to associate perfect propriety with my dear Betty. The days went on. The reception arrangements were perfected. We only waited for the date of Boyce's arrival to be fixed. That depended on the date of the particular investiture by the King which Boyce's convalescence should allow him to attend. At last the date was fixed. A few days before the investiture I went to London and called at Lady Fanshawe's in Eccleston Street, whither he had been removed after leaving the hospital. I was received in the dining room on the ground floor by Boyce and his mother. He wore black glasses to hide terrible disfigurement. He lifted them to show me. One eye had been extracted. The other was seared and sightless. He greeted me as heartily as ever, made little jests over his infirmity, treating it lightly for his mother's sake. She, on her side, deemed it her duty to exhibit equal cheerfulness. She boasted of his progress in self-reliance and in the accomplishment of various little blind man's tricks. At her bidding, he lit a cigarette for my benefit, by means of a patent fuse. He said, when he had succeeded, "Better than last time you saw me, eh, Meredith?" "What was that?" asked Mrs. Boyce. "He nearly burned his fingers," said I, shortly. I had no desire to relate the incident. We talked of the coming ceremony, and I gave them the details of the programme. Boyce had been right in accepting on the score of his mother. Only once had she been the central figure in any public ceremony, on her wedding day in the years long ago. Here was a new kind of wedding day in her old age. The prospect filled her with a tremulous joy, which was to both of them a compensation. She bubbled over with pride and excitement at her inclusion in the homage that was to be paid to the valor of her only son. "After all," she said, "I did bring him into the world, so I can claim some credit. I only hope I shan't cry and make a fool of myself. They won't expect me to keep on bowing, will they? I once saw Queen Victoria driving through the streets, and I thought how dreadfully her poor old neck must have ached." On the latter point I reassured her. On the drive from the station, Boyce would take the salute of the troops on the line of route. If she smiled charmingly at them, their hearts would be satisfied, and if she just nodded at them occasionally in a motherly sort of way, they would be enchanted. She informed me that she was having a new dress made for the occasion. She had also bought a new hat, which I must see. A servant was summoned and dispatched for it. She tried it on girlishly before the mirror over the mantelpiece, and received my compliments. "Tell me what it looks like," said Boyce. "You might as well ask a savage in Central Africa to describe the interior of a submarine as the ordinary man to describe a woman's hat." My artless endeavours caused considerable merriment. To hear Boyce's gay laughter, one would have thought he had never a care in the world. When I took my leave, Mrs. Boyce accompanied Marigold and myself to the front door. "Did you ever hear of anything so dreadful?" she whispered, and I saw her lips quivering and the tears rolling down her cheeks. "If he weren't so brave and wonderful, I should break my heart." "What do you suppose you are yourself, my dear old friend?" said I, over Marigold's shoulder. On the evening before the reception, Betty was shown into the library. It was late, getting on towards my bedtime, and I was nodding in front of the fire. "I'm just in and out, Majy dear," she said. "I had to come. I didn't want to give you too many shocks." At my expression of alarm she laughed. "I've only run in to tell you that I've made up my mind to come to the Town Hall to morrow." I looked at her, and I suppose my hands moved in a slight gesture. "By that," she said, "I suppose you mean you can never tell what I'm going to do next." "You've guessed it, my dear," said I. "Do you disapprove?" "I couldn't be so presumptuous." She bent over me and caught the lapels of my jacket. "Oh, don't be so dreadfully dignified. I want you to understand. Everybody is going to pay honour tomorrow to a man who has given everything he could to his country. Don't you think it would be petty of me if I stood out? What have the dead things that have passed between us to do with my tribute as an Englishwoman?" What indeed? I asked her whether she was attending in her private capacity or as one of the representatives of the V.A.D. nurses. I learned for the 1000th time that Betty Connor did not deal in half measures. If she went at all, it was as Betty Connor that she would go. Her aunts would accompany her. It was part of the municipal ordering of things that the town clerk should have sent them the special cards of invitation. "I think it my duty to go," said Betty. "If you think so, my dear," said I, "then it is your duty. So there's nothing more to be said about it." Betty kissed the top of my head and went off. We come now to the morning of the great day. Everything had been finally settled. The Mayor and Aldermen, Lady Fenimore and the Aldermen's wives, the Lord Lieutenant in unofficial mufti, and Lady Laleham, great though officially obscure lady, the General of the Division quartered in the neighbourhood and officers of his staff, and a few other magnates to meet the 3 o'clock train by which the Boyces were due to arrive. The station hung with flags and inscriptions. A guard of honour and a band in the station yard, with a fleet of motor cars in waiting. Troops lining the route from station to Town Hall. More troops in the decorated market square, including the Godbury School O.T.C. and the Wellingsford and Godbury Volunteers. I heard that the latter were very anxious to fire off a feu de joie, but were restrained owing to lack of precedent. The local fire brigade, in freshly burnished helmets, were to follow the procession of motor cars, and behind them motor omnibuses with the nurses. Marigold, although his attendance on me precluded him from taking part in the parade of volunteers, appeared in full grey uniform with all his medals and the black patch of ceremony over his eyeless socket. I must confess to regarding him with some jealousy. I too should have liked to wear my decorations. If a man swears to you that he is free from such little vanities, he is more often than not a mere liar. But a broken down old soldier, although still drawing pay from the government, is not allowed to wear uniform, which I think is outrageous, and he can't go and plaster himself with medals when he is wearing on his head a hard felt hat. My envy of the martial looking Marigold is a proof that my mind was not busied with sterner preoccupations. I ate my breakfast with the serene conscience not only of a man who knows he has done his duty, but of an organizer confident in the success of his schemes. The abominable weather of snows and tempests from which we had suffered for weeks had undergone a change. It was a mild morning, brightened by a pale convalescent sort of sun, and there was just a little hope of spring in the air. I felt content with everything and everybody. About 11 o'clock the buzz of the library telephone disturbed my comfortable perusal of the newspaper. I wheeled towards the instrument. Sir Anthony was speaking. "Can you come round at once? Very urgent. The car is on its way to you." "What's the matter?" I asked. He could not tell me over the wires. I was to take it that my presence was urgently needed. "I'll come along at once," said I. Some hitch doubtless had occurred. Perhaps the War Office, whose ways were ever weird and unaccountable, had forbidden the General to take part in such a village pump demonstration. Perhaps Lady Laleham had insisted on her husband coming down like a uniformed Lord Lieutenant on the fold. Perhaps the hero himself was laid up with measles. End of chapter 19, Part 1. Chapter 19, Part 2 of The Red Planet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Red Planet by William J. Locke. Chapter 19, Part 2. With the lightest heart I drove to Wellings Park, Marigold, straight as a ramrod, sitting in front by the chauffeur. As soon as Pardoe, the butler, had brought out my chair, and Marigold had settled me in it, Sir Anthony, very red and flustered, appeared, and, shaking me nervously by the hand, said without preliminary greeting, "Come into the library." He, I think, had come from the morning room on the right of the hall. The library was on the left. He flung open the door. I steered myself into the room, and there, standing on the white bearskin hearthrug, his back to the fire, his hands in his pockets, his 6 inches of stiff white beard stuck aggressively outward, I saw Daniel Gedge. While I gaped in astonishment, Sir Anthony shut the door behind him, drew a straight-backed chair from the wall, planted it roughly some distance away from the fire, and, pointing to it, bade Gedge sit down. Gedge obeyed. Sir Anthony took the hearthrug position, his hands behind his back, his legs apart. "This man," said he, "has come to me with a ridiculous beastly story." At first I was undecided whether I should listen to him or kick him out. I thought it wiser to listen to him in the presence of a reputable witness. That's why I've sent for you, Duncan. "Now you just begin all over again, my man," said he, turning to Gedge, "and remember that anything you say here will be used against you at your trial." Gedge laughed, I must admit with some justification. "You forget, Sir Anthony, I'm not a criminal, and you're not a policeman." "I'm the Mayor to this town, sir," cried Sir Anthony. "I'm also a Justice of the Peace." "And I'm a law abiding citizen," retorted Gedge. "You're an infernal socialistic pro German," exclaimed Sir Anthony. "Prove it. I only ask you to prove it. No matter what your private opinions may be, you just try to bring me up under the Defence of the Realm Act, and you'll find you can't touch me." I held out a hand. "Forgive me for interrupting," said I, "but what is all this discussion about?" Gedge crossed one leg over the other and drew his beard through his fingers. Sir Anthony was about to burst into speech, but I checked him with a gesture and turned to Gedge. "It has nothing to do with political opinions," said he. "It has to do with the death, nearly 2 years ago, of Miss Althea Fenimore, Sir Anthony's only daughter." Sir Anthony, his face congested, glared at him malevolently. I started, with a gasp of surprise, and stared at the man who, caressing his beard, looked from one to the other of us with an air of satisfaction. "Get on," said Sir Anthony. "You are going to give a civic reception to day to Colonel Boyce, V.C., aren't you?" "Yes, I am," snapped Sir Anthony. "Do you think you ought to do it when I tell you that Colonel Boyce, V.C., murdered Miss Althea Fenimore on the night of the 25th June, 2 years ago?" "Yes," said Sir Anthony. "And do you know why? Because I know you to be a liar and a scoundrel." I can never describe the awful horror that numbed me to the heart. For a few moments my body seemed as lifeless as my legs. The charge, astounding almost to grotesqueness in the eyes of Sir Anthony, and rousing him to mere wrath, deprived me of the power of speech. For I knew, in that dreadful instant, that the man's words contained some elements of truth. All the pieces of the puzzle that had worried me at odd times for months fitted themselves together in a vivid flash. Boyce and Althea. I had never dreamed of associating their names. That association was the key of the puzzle. Out of the darkness, disturbing things shone clear. Boyce's abrupt retirement from Wellingsford before the war, his cancellation by default of his engagement, his morbid desire a year ago to keep secret his presence in his own house, Gedge's veiled threat to me in the street to "use a way that'll knock all you great people of Wellingsford off your high horses," his extraordinary interview with Boyce, his generally expressed hatred of Boyce. Was this too the secret which he let out in his cups to Randall Holmes, and which drove the young man from his society? And Betty? Boyce was a devil. She wished he were dead. And her words, "You have behaved worse to others. I don't wonder at your shrinking from showing your face here." How much did Betty know? There was the lost week, in Carlisle, in poor Althea's life. And then there were Boyce's half confessions, the glimpses he had afforded me into the tormented soul. To me he had condemned himself out of his own mouth. I repeat that, sitting there paralysed by the sudden shock of it, I knew, not that the man was speaking the literal truth, God forbid, but that Boyce was, in some degree, responsible for Althea's death. "Calling me names won't alter the facts, Sir Anthony," said Gedge, with a touch of insolence. "I was there at the time. I saw it." "If that's true," Sir Anthony retorted, "you're an accessory after the fact, and in greater danger of being hanged than ever." He turned to me in his abrupt way. "Now that we've heard this blackguard, shall we hand him over to the police?" Being directly addressed, I recovered my nerve. "Before doing that," said I, "perhaps it would be best for us to hear what kind of a story he has to tell us." We should also like to know his motives in not denouncing the supposed murderer at once, and in keeping his knowledge hidden all this time." "With regard to the last part of your remarks, I dare say you would," said Gedge. "Only I don't know whether I'll go so far as to oblige you. Anyhow, you must have discovered that I don't particularly care about your class. I've been preaching against your idleness and vanity and vices, and the strangling grip you have on the throats of the people, ever since I was a young man. If one of your lot chose to do in another of your lot, a common story of seduction and crime." At this slur in his daughter's honor Sir Anthony broke out fiercely, and for a moment I feared lest he would throw himself on Gedge and wring his neck. I managed to check his outburst and bring him to reason. He resumed his attitude on the hearth rug. "As I was saying," Gedge continued, rather frightened, "from my sociological point of view I considered the affair no business of mine. I speak of it now because ever since war broke out your class and the parasitical bourgeoisie have done your best to reduce me to starvation. I thought it would be pleasant to get a bit of my own back. Just a little bit," he added, rubbing his hands. "If you think you've done it, you'll find yourself mistaken." Gedge shrugged his shoulders and pulled his beard. I hated the light in his little crafty eyes. I feel sure he had been looking forward for months to this moment of pure happiness. "Having given us an insight into your motives, which seem consistent with what we know of your character," said I, judicially, "will you now make your statement of facts?" "What's the good of listening further to his lies?" interrupted Sir Anthony. "I'm a magistrate. I can give the police at once a warrant for his arrest." Again I pacified him. "Let us hear what the man has to say." Gedge began. He spoke by the book, like one who repeats a statement carefully prepared. "It was past 10 o'clock on the night of the 25th June, 1914. I had just finished supper when I was rung up by the landlord of the Three Feathers on the Fairfield Road. It's the inn about a quarter of a mile from the Locke gates. He said that the district secretary of the Red Democratic Federation was staying there, his brother-in-law, if you want to know, and he hadn't received my report. I must explain that I am the local secretary, and as there was to be an important conference of the Federation at Derby the next day, the district secretary ought to have been in possession of my report on local affairs. I had drawn up the report. My daughter Phyllis had typed it, and she ought to have posted it. On questioning her, I found she had neglected to do so. I explained this over the wires, and said I would bring the report at once to the Three Feathers. I only tell you all this, in which you can't be interested, so that you can't say, 'What were you doing on a lonely road at that time of night?' My daughter and the landlord of the Three Feathers can corroborate this part of my story. I set out on my bicycle. It was bright moonlight. You know that for about 200 yards before the Lock gate, and for about 20 after, the towing path is raised above the level of the main road, which runs parallel with it a few yards away. There were strips of market garden between. When I got to this open bit, I saw two persons up on the towing path. One was a girl with a loose kind of cloak and a hat. The other was a man wearing a soft felt hat and a light overcoat. The overcoat was open, and I saw that he was wearing it over evening dress. That caught my attention. What was this swell in evening dress doing there with a girl? I slowed down and dismounted. They didn't see me. I got into the shadow of a whitethorn. They turned their faces so that the moon beat full on them. I saw them as plain as I see you. They were Colonel Boyce, V.C., Major then, and your daughter, Mr. Mayor, Miss Althea Fenimore." He paused as though to point the dramatic effect, and twisted round, sticking out his horrible beard at Sir Anthony. Sir Anthony, his hands thrust deep in his trouser pockets and his bullet head bent forward, glared at him balefully out of his old blue eyes. But he said never a word. Gedge continued. They didn't speak very loud, so I could only hear a scrap or two of their conversation. They seemed to be quarrelling. She wanted him to do something which he wouldn't do. I heard the words marriage and disgrace. They stood still for a moment, then they turned back. I had overtaken them, you know. I remounted my bicycle and rode to the Three Feathers. I was there about a quarter of an hour or 20 minutes. Then I rode back for home. When I came in sight of the lock, there I saw a man standing alone, sharp in the moonlight. As I came nearer, I recognized the same man, Major Boyce. There were no lights in the lock keeper's cottage. He and his wife had gone to bed long before. I was so interested that I forgot what I was doing and ran into the hedge, so that I nearly came down. There was the noise of the scrape and drag of the machine, which must have sounded very loud in the stillness. It startled him, for he looked all round, but he didn't see me, for I was under the hedge. Then suddenly he started running. He ran as if the devil was after him. I saw him squash down his Trilby hat so that it was shapeless. Then he disappeared along the path. I thought this a queer proceeding. Why should he have taken to his heels? I thought I should like to see him again. If he kept to the towing path, his shortest way home, he was bound to go along the Chestnut Avenue, where, as you know, the road and the path again come together. On a bicycle it was easy to get there before him. I sat down on a bench and waited. Presently he comes, walking fast, his hat still squashed in all over his ears. I walked my bicycle slap in front of him. "Good night, Major," I said. He stared at me as if he didn't know me. Then he seemed to pull himself together, and said, "Good night, Gedge. What are you doing out at this time of night?" "If it comes to that, sir," said I, "what are you?" Then he says, very haughty, as if I was the dirt under his feet, "I suppose, Sir Anthony Fenimore and Major Meredyth, you think that me and my class are, by divine prescription, the dirt beneath your feet. But you're damn well mistaken." Then he says, "What the devil do you mean?" and catches hold of the front wheel of the bicycle and swings it and me out of his way, so that I had a nasty fall, with the machine on top of me, and he marches off. I picked myself up furious with anger. I am an elderly man, and not accustomed to that sort of treatment. I yell out, "What have you been doing with the squire's daughter on the towing path?" It pulled him up short. He made a step or two towards me, and again he asked me what I meant, and this time I told him. He called me a liar, swore he had never been on any tow path, or had seen any squire's daughter, and threatened to murder me. As soon as I could mount my bicycle, I left him and made for home. The next afternoon, if you remember, the unfortunate young lady's body was found at the bottom of 3 fathoms of water by the lock gates. He had spoken so clearly, so unfalteringly, that Sir Anthony had been surprised into listening without interruption. The bulldog expression on his face never changed. When Gedge had come to the end, he said, "Will you again tell me your object in coming to me with this disgusting story?" Gedge lifted his bushy eyebrows. "Don't you believe it even now?" "Not a word of it," replied Sir Anthony. "I ought to remind you of another point," said Gedge. "Was Major Boyce ever seen in Wellingsford after that night? No. He went off by the first train the next morning. Went abroad and stayed there till the outbreak of war." "I happen to know he had made arrangements to start for Norway that morning," said Sir Anthony. "He had called here a day or two before to say good bye." "Did he write you any letter of condolence?" Gedge asked sneeringly. I saw a sudden spasm pass over Sir Anthony's features, but he said in the same tone as before, "I am not going to answer insolent questions." Gedge turned to me with the air of a man giving up argument with a child. "What do you think of it, Major Meredyth?" What could I say? I had kept a grim iron face all through the proceedings. I could only reply, "I agree entirely with Sir Anthony." Gedge rose and thrust his hand into his jacket pocket. "You gentlemen are hard to convince. If you want proof positive, just read that." And he held a letter out to Sir Anthony. Sir Anthony glared at him and abruptly plucked the letter out of his hand. For the fraction of a second he stood irresolute. Then he threw it behind him into the blazing fire. "Do you think I'm going to soil my mind with your dirty forgeries?" Gedge laughed. "You think you've queered my pitch, I suppose. You haven't. I've heaps more incriminating letters. That was only a sample." "Publish one of them at your peril," said I. "Pray, Mr. Major Meredyth," said he, "what is to prevent me?" "Penal servitude for malicious slander." "I should win my case." "In that event they would get you on your own showing for being an accessory after the fact of murder, and for blackmail." "Suppose I risk it?" "You won't," said I. Sir Anthony turned to the bell push by the side of the mantelpiece. "What's the good of talking to this double-eyed scoundrel?" He pointed to the door. "You infamous liar, get out, and if I ever catch you prowling round this house, I'll set the dogs on you." Gedge marched to the door and turned on the threshold and shook his fist. "You'll repent your folly till your dying day." "To hell with you!" cried Sir Anthony. The door slammed. We were left alone. An avalanche of silence overwhelmed us. Heaven knows how long we remained speechless and motionless, I in my wheel chair, he standing on the hearth rug staring awfully in front of him. At last he drew a deep breath, and threw up his arms and flung himself down on a leather-covered couch, where he sat, elbows on knees and his head in his hands. After a while he lifted a drawn face. "It's true, Duncan," said he, "and you know it." "I don't know it," I replied stoutly, "any more than you do." He rose in his nervous way and came swiftly to me and clapped both his hands on my frail shoulders and bent over me, he was a little man, as I have told you, and put his face so close to mine that I could feel his breath on my cheek. "Upon your soul as a Christian, you know that man wasn't lying." I looked into his eyes, about 6 inches from mine. "Boyce never murdered Althea," I said. "But he is the man I've been looking for." I pushed him away with both hands, using all my strength. It was too horrible. "Suppose he is. What then?" He fell back a pace or two. Once I remember saying, "If I ever get hold of that man, God help him." He clenched his fists and started to pace up and down the library, passing and repassing my chair. At last my nerves could stand it no longer, and I called on him to halt. "Gedge's story is curiously incomplete," said I. "We ought to have cross-examined him more closely. Is it likely that Boyce should have gone off, leaving behind him a witness of his crime, who he had threatened to murder, and who he must have known would have given information as soon as the death was discovered? And don't you think Gedge's reason for holding his tongue very unconvincing? His fool hatred of our class, instead of keeping him cynically indifferent, would have made him lodge information at once and gloat over our discomfiture. I could not choose but come to the defence of the unhappy man whom I had learned to call my friend, although, for all my trying, I could conjure up no doubt as to his intimate relation with the tragedy. As Sir Anthony did not speak, I went on. "You can't judge a man with Leonard Boyce's record on the ex parte statement of a malevolent beast like Gedge. Look back. If there had been any affair between Althea and Boyce, the merest foolish flirtation even, do you think it would have passed unnoticed? You, Edith, Betty, I myself, would have cast an uneasy eye. When we were looking about some months ago, at the time of your sister-in-law's visit, for a possible man, the thought of Leonard Boyce never entered our heads. The only man you could rush at was young Randall Holmes, and I laughed you out of the idea. Just throw your mind back, Anthony, and try to recall any suspicious incident. You can't." I paused rhetorically, expecting a reply. None came. He just sat looking at me in a dead way. I continued my special pleading, and the more I said, the more was I baffled by his dead stare, and the more unconvincing platitudes did I find myself uttering. Some people may be able to speak vividly to a deaf and dumb creature. On this occasion I tried hard to do so, and failed. After a while my words dribbled out with difficulty, and eventually ceased. At last he spoke in the dull, toneless way of a dead man, presuming that the dead could speak. "You may talk till you're black in the face, but you know as well as I do that the man told the truth, or practically the truth. What he said he saw, he saw. What motives have been at the back of his miserable mind, I don't know. You say I can't recall suspicious incidents? I can. I'll tell you one. I came across them once, about a month before the thing happened, among the greenhouses. I think we were having one of our tennis parties. I heard her using angry words, and when I appeared, her face was flushed, and there were tears in her eyes. She was taken aback for a second, and then she rushed up to me. 'I think he's perfectly horrid. He says that Jingo,' pointing to the dog, 'you remember Jingo the Sealingham, she was devoted to him, he died last year, he says that Jingo is a mongrel, a throwback.' Boyce said he was only teasing her, and made pretty apologies. I left it at that. Hit a dog or a horse belonging to Althea, and you hit Althea. That was her way. The incident went out of my mind till this morning. Other incidents, too. One thinks pretty quick at times. Again this scoundrel hit me on the raw. Boyce never wrote to us. Sent us through his mother a conventional word of condolence. Edith and I were hurt. That was one of the things that made me speak so angrily of him when he wouldn't come and dine with us." Once more I pleaded. "Your Sealingham incident doesn't impress me. Why not take it at its face value? As for the letter of condolence, that may have 20 explanations." He passed his hand over his cropped iron grey head. "What are you driving at, Duncan? You know as well as I do. You know more than I do. I saw it in your face ever since that man opened his mouth." "If you're so sure of everything," said I foolishly, relaxing grip on my self-control, "why did you hound him out of the place for a liar?" He leaped to his feet and spread himself into a fighting attitude, for all the world like a half-dead bantam cock springing into a new lease of combative life. "Do you think I'd let a dunghill beast like that crow over me? Do you think I'd let him imagine for a minute that anything he said could influence me in my public duty? By God, sir, what kind of a worm do you think I am?" His sudden fury disconcerted me. All this time I had been wondering what kind of catastrophe was going to happen during the next few hours. I am afraid I haven't made clear to you the ghastly racket in my brain. There was the town all beflagged, every one making holiday, all the pomp and circumstance at our disposal, awaiting the signal to be displayed. There was the blind conquering hero almost on his way to local apotheosis. And here were Sir Anthony and I with the revelation of the man Gedge. It was a fantastic, baffling situation. I had been haunted by the dread of discussing it. So in reply to his outburst I simply said, "What are you going to do?" He drew himself up with his obstinate chin in the air and looked at me straight. "If God gives me strength, I am going to do what lies before me." At this moment Lady Fenimore came in. "Mr. Winterbotham would like to speak to you a minute, Anthony. It's something about the school children." "All right, my dear, I'll go to him at once," said Sir Anthony. "You'll stay and lunch with us, Duncan?" I declined on the plea that I should have to nurse myself for a strenuous day. Sir Anthony might play the Roman father, but it was beyond my power to play the Roman father's guest. End of chapter 19, part 2. Chapter 20 of The Red Planet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Red Planet by William J. Locke. Chapter 20. How he passed through the ordeal I don't know. If ever a man stood captain of his soul, it was Antony Fenimore that day, and his soul was steel armored. Perhaps, if proof had come to him from an untainted source, it might have modified his attitude. I cannot tell. Without doubt the knavery of Gedge set aflame his indignation, or rather the fierce pride of the great old Tory gentleman. He would have walked through hell fire sooner than yielded an inch to Gedge. So much would scornful defiance have done. But behind all this, and I am as certain of it as I am certain that one day I shall die, burned even fiercer, steadier, and clearer the unquenchable fire of patriotic duty. He was dealing not with a man who had sinned terribly towards him, but with a man who had offered his life over and over again to his country, a man who had given to his country the sight of his eyes, a man on whose breast the King himself had pinned the supreme badge of honor in his gift. He was dealing not with a private individual, but with a national hero. In his small capacity as Mayor of Wellingsford, he was but the mouthpiece of a national sentiment. And more than that, this ceremony was an appeal to the unimaginative, the sluggish, the faint-hearted. In its little way, and please remember that all tremendous enthusiasms are lit by these little fires, it was a proclamation of the undying glory of England. It was impersonal, it was national, it was imperial. In its little way, it was of vast, far-reaching importance. I want you to remember these things in order that you should understand the mental processes, or soul processes, or whatever you like, of Sir Anthony Fenimore. Picture him, the most unheroic little man you can imagine. Clean-shaven, bullet-headed, close-cropped, his face ruddy and wrinkled like a withered apple, his eyes a misty blue, his big nose marked like a network of veins, his hands glazed and reddened like his face by wind and weather, standing, even under his mayoral robes, like a jockey. Of course he had the undefinable air of breeding, no one could have mistaken his class. But he was an undistinguished, very ordinary-looking little man, and indeed he had done nothing for the past half-century to distinguish himself above his fellows. There are thousands of his type, masters of English country houses, and of all the thousands, every one brought up against the stern issues of life would have acted like Antony Fenimore. I say would have acted, but any one who has lived in England during the war knows that they have so acted. These incarnations of the commonplace, the object of the disdain before the war of the self-styled intellectuals, if the war sweeps the insufferable term into oblivion it will have done some good, these honest, unassuming gentlemen have responded heroically to the great appeal. And when the intellectuals have thought of their intellects or their skins, they have thought only of their duty. And it was only the heroical sense of duty that sustained Sir Anthony Fenimore that day. I did not see the reception at the railway station, or join the triumphal procession, but went early to the town hall and took my seat on the platform. I glibly say took my seat. A wheel-chair, sent there previously, was hoisted, with me inside, on to the platform, by Marigold and a porter. After all these years, I still hate to be publicly paraded like a grizzled baby in Marigold's arms. For convenience' sake, I was posted at the front left-hand corner. The hall soon filled. The first 3 rows of seats were reserved for the recipients of the municipality's special invitation. The remainder were occupied by the successful applicants for tickets. From my almost solitary perch I watched the fluttering and excited crowd. The town band in the organ gallery at the further end discoursed martial music. From the main door beneath them ran the central gangway to the platform. I recognized many friends. In the front row, with her two aunts, sat Betty, very demure in her widow's hat relieved by its little white band of frilly stuff beneath the brim. She looked unusually pale. I could not help watching her intently, and trying to divine how much she knew of the story of Boyce and Althea. She caught my eye, nodded, and smiled wanly. My situation was uncanny. In this crowded assemblage in front of me, whispering, talking, laughing beneath the blare of the band, not one, save Betty, had a suspicion of the tragedy. At times they seemed to melt into a shadow mass of dreamland. Time crawled on very slowly. Anxious forebodings oppressed me. Had Sir Anthony's valiancy stood the test? Had he been able to shake hands with his daughter's betrayer? Had he broken down during the drive side by side with him amid the hurraying of the townsfolk? And Gedge, had he found some madman's means of proclaiming the scandal aloud? Every nerve in my body was strained. Marigold, in his uniform and medals and patch and grey service cap plugged over his black wig, stood sentry by the side of the platform next my chair. All of a sudden he pulled out of his side pocket a phial of red liqueur and a medicine glass. He poured out the dose and handed it to me. I turned on him wrathfully. "What the dickens is that?" "Dr. Cliffe's orders, sir." "When did he order it?" "When I told him what you looked like after interviewing Mr. Daniel Gedge. And he said if you was to look like that again I was to give you this. So I'm giving it to you, sir." There was no arguing with Marigold in front of 1,000 people. I swallowed the stuff quickly. He put the phial and glass back in his pocket, and resumed his wooden sentry attitude by my chair. I must own to feeling better for the draught. But, thought I, if the strain of the situation is so great for me, what must it be for Sir Anthony? Presently the muffled sounds of outside cheering penetrated the hall. The band stopped abruptly, to begin again with "See the Conquering Hero Comes," when the civic procession appeared through the great doors. There was little Sir Anthony in his robes, grave and imposing, and beside him Mrs. Boyce, flushed, bright-eyed, and tearful. Then came Lady Fenimore with Boyce, black spectacled, soldierly, bull-necked, his little bronze cross conspicuous among the medals on his breast, his elbow gripped by a weather-beaten young soldier, one of his captains, as I learned afterwards, home on leave, who had claimed the privilege of guiding his blind footsteps. And behind came the aldermen and the councillors, and the general and his staff, and the Lord Lieutenant and Lady Laleham and the other members of the reception committee. The cheering drowned the strains of the Conquering Hero. Places were taken on the platform. To the right of the mayor sat Boyce, to the left his mother. On the table in front were set scrolls and caskets. You see, we had arranged that Mrs. Boyce should have an address and a casket all to herself. The gallery soon was picturesquely filled with the nurses, and the fire brigade, bright helmeted, was massed in the doorway. God gave the steel-hearted little man strength to go through the ordeal. He delivered his carefully prepared oration in a voice that never faltered. The passages referring to Boyce's blindness he spoke with an accent of amazing sincerity. When he had ended, the responsive audience applauded tumultuously. From my seat by the edge of the platform I watched Betty. 2 red spots burned in her cheeks. The addresses were read, the caskets presented. Boyce remained standing, about to respond. He still held the casket in both hands. His fidus Achates, guessing his difficulty, sprang up, took it from him, and laid it on the table. Boyce turned to him with his charming smile, and said, "Thanks, old man." Again the tumult broke out. Men cheered, and women wept and waved wet handkerchiefs. And he stood smiling at his unseen audience. When he spoke, his deep, beautifully modulated voice held every one under its spell, and he spoke modestly and gaily, like a brave gentleman. I bent forward, as far as I was able, and scanned his face. Never once during the whole ceremony did the telltale twitch appear at the corners of his lips. He stood there the incarnation of the modern knights, sans fear and sans reproach. I cannot tell which of the two, he or Sir Anthony, the more moved my wondering admiration. Each exhibited a glorious defiance. You may say that Boyce, receiving in his debonair fashion the encomiums of the man whom he had wronged, was merely exhibiting the familiar callousness of the criminal. If you do, I throw up my brief. I shall have failed utterly to accomplish my object in writing this book. I want no tears of sensibility shed over Boyce. I want you to judge him by the evidence that I am trying to put before you. If you judge him as a criminal, it is my poor presentation of the evidence that is at fault. I claim for Boyce a certain splendour of character for all his grievous sins, a splendour which no criminal in the world's history has ever achieved. I beg you therefore to suspend your judgment until I have finished, as far as my poor powers allow, my unravelling of his tangled skein. And pray remember, too, that I have sought all through to present you with the facts pari passu with my knowledge of them. I have tried to tell the story through myself. I could think of no other way of creating an essential verisimilitude. Yet even now, writing in the light of full knowledge, I cannot admit that when Boyce in that town hall faced the world, for in the deep tragic sense Wellingsford was his world, any one knowing as much as I did would have been justified in calling his demeanour criminal callousness. I say that he exhibited a glorious defiance. He defied the concrete Gedge. He defied the more abstract, but none the less real, tormenting furies. He defied remorse. In accepting Sir Anthony's praise, he defied the craven in his own soul. After a speech or two more, to which I did not listen, the proceedings in the town hall ended. I drew a breath of relief. No breakdown by Sir Anthony, no scandalous interruption by Gedge, had marred the impressive ceremony. The band in the gallery played "God Save the King." The crowd in the body of the hall, who had stood for the anthem, sat down again, evidently waiting for Boyce and the notables to pass out. The assemblage on the platform broke up. Several members, among them the General, who paused to shake hands with Boyce and his mother, left the hall by the private side door. The Lord Lieutenant and Lady Laleham followed him soon afterwards. Then the less magnificent crowded round Boyce, each eager for a personal exchange of words with the hero. Sir Anthony remained at his post, keeping on the outskirts of the throng, bidding formal adieux to those who went away. Presently I saw that Boyce was asking for me, for some one pointed me out to his officer attendant, who led him down the steps of the platform and round the edge to my seat. "Well, it has gone off all right," said he. "Let me introduce Captain Winslow, more than ever my right-hand man. Major Meredyth." We exchanged bows. "The old mother's as pleased as Punch. She didn't know she was going to get a little box of her own. I should like to have seen her face. I did hear her give one of her little squeals. Did you?" "No," said I, "but I saw her face. It was that of a saint in an unexpected beatitude." He laughed. "Dear old mother," said he. "She has deserved a show." He turned away unconsciously, and, thinking to address me, addressed the first row of spectators. "I suppose there's a lot of folks here that I know." By chance he seemed to be looking through his black glasses straight at Betty a few feet away. She rose impulsively, and, before all Wellingsford, went up to him with hand outstretched. "There's one at any rate, Colonel Boyce. I'm Betty Connor." "No need to tell me that," said he, bowing. Winslow, at his elbow, most scrupulous of prompters, whispered, "She wants to shake hands with you." So their hands met. He kept hers an appreciable second or two in his grasp. "I hope you will accept my congratulations," said Betty. "I have already accepted them, very gratefully. My mother conveyed them to me. She was deeply touched by your letter. And may I, too, say how deeply touched I am by your coming here?" Betty looked swiftly round, and her cheeks flushed, for there were many of us within earshot. She laughed off her embarrassment. "You have developed from a man into a Wellingsford institution, and I had to come and see you inaugurated. My aunts, too, are here." She beckoned to them. "They are shyer than I am." The elderly ladies came forward and spoke their pleasant words of congratulation. Mrs. Holmes and others, encouraged, followed their example. Mrs. Boyce suddenly swooped from the platform into the middle of the group and kissed Betty, who emerged from the excited ladies' embrace blushing furiously. She shook hands with Betty's aunts and thanked them for their presence, and in the old lady's mind the reconciliation of the two houses was complete. Then, with cheeks of a more delicate natural pink than any living valetudinarian of her age could boast of, and with glistening eyes, she made her way to me, and reaching up and drawing me down, kissed me too. While all this was going on, the body of the hall began to empty. The programme had arranged for nothing more, by way of ceremonial, to take place. But a public gathering always hopes for something unexpected, and, when it does not happen, takes its disappointment philosophically. I think Betty's action must have shown them that the rest of the proceedings were to be purely private and informal. The platform also gradually thinned, until at last, looking round, I saw that only Sir Anthony and Lady Fenimore and Winterbotham, the town clerk, remained. Then Lady Fenimore joined us. We were about a score, myself perched on the edge and corner of the platform, the rest standing on the floor of the hall in a sector round me, Marigold, of course, in the middle of them by my side, like an ill-graven image. As soon as she could, Lady Fenimore came up to me. "Don't you think it splendid of Betty Connor to bury the hatchet so publicly?" she whispered. "The war," said I, "is a solvent of many human complications." "It is, indeed." Then she added, "I am going to have a little dinner party some time soon for the Boyces. I sounded him to day, and he practically promised. I'll ask the Lelams. Of course you'll come. Now that things have shown themselves so topsy-turvy, I've been wondering whether I should ask Betty." "Does Anthony know of this dinner party?" I inquired. "What does it matter whether he does or not?" she laughed. "Dinner parties come within my province, and I'm mistress of it." Of course Boyce had half promised. What else could he do without discourtesy? But the banquet which, in her unsuspecting innocence, she proposed, seemed to me a horrible meal. Doubtless it would seem so to Sir Anthony. At the moment I did not know whether he intended to tell Gedge's story to his wife. At any rate, hitherto he had not done so. "All the same, my dear Edith," I replied, "Anthony may have a word to say. I happen to know he has no particular personal friendship for Boyce, who, if you'll forgive my saying so, has treated you rather cavalierly for the past 2 years. Anthony's welcome today was purely public and official. It had nothing to do with his private feelings." "But they have changed. He was referring to the matter only this morning at breakfast, and suggesting things we could do to lighten the poor man's affliction." "I don't think a dinner party would lighten it," I said. "And if I were you, I wouldn't suggest it to Anthony." "That's rather mysterious." She looked at me shrewdly. "And there's another mysterious thing. Anthony's like a yapping sphinx over it. What were you two talking to Gedge about this morning?" "Nothing particular." "That's nonsense, Duncan. Gedge was making himself unpleasant. He never does anything else." "If you want to know," said I, with a convulsive effort of invention, "we heard that he was preparing some sort of demonstration, going to bring down some of his precious Anti War League people." "He wouldn't have the pluck!" she exclaimed. "Anyhow," said I, "we thought we had better have him in and read him the Riot, or rather the Defence of the Realm, Act. That's all." "Then why on earth couldn't Anthony tell me?" "You ought to know the mixture of sugar and pepper in your husband's nature better than I do, my dear Edith," I replied. Her laugh reassured me. I had turned a difficult corner. No doubt she would go to Sir Anthony with my explanation, and either receive his acquiescence or learn the real truth. She was bidding me farewell when Sir Anthony came along the platform to the chair. I glanced up, but I saw that he did not wish to speak to me. He was looking grim and tired. He called down to his wife. "It's time to move, dear. The troops are still standing outside." She bustled about giving the signal for departure, first running to Boyce and taking him by the sleeve. I had not noticed that he had withdrawn with Betty a few feet away from the little group. They were interrupted in an animated conversation. At the sight I felt a keen pang of repulsion. Those two ought not to talk together as old friends. It outraged decencies. It was all very well for Betty to play the magnanimous and patriotic Englishwoman. By her first word of welcome she had fulfilled the part. But this flushed, eager talk lay far beyond the scope of patriotic duty. How could they thus converse over the body of the dead Althea? With both of them was I indignant. In my inmost heart I felt horribly and vulgarly jealous. I may as well confess it. Deeply as I had sworn blood brotherhood with Boyce, regardless of the crimes he might or might not have committed, I could not admit him into that inner brotherhood of which Betty and I alone were members. And this is just a roundabout, shamefaced way of saying that, at that moment, I discovered that I was hopelessly, insanely in love with Betty. The knowledge came to me in a great wave of dismay. "You'll let me see you again, won't you?" he asked. "If you like." I don't think I heard the words, but I traced them on their lips. They parted. Sir Anthony descended from the platform and gave his arm to Mrs. Boyce. Lady Fenimore still clung to Boyce. Winterbotham came next, bearing the two caskets, which had been lying neglected on the table. The sparse company followed down the empty hall. Marigold signalled to the porter, and they hoisted down my chair. Betty, who had lingered during the operation, walked by my side. Being able now to propel myself, I dismissed Marigold to a discreet position in the rear. Betty, her face still slightly flushed, said: "I'm waiting for congratulations, which seem to be about as overwhelming as snow in August. Don't you think I've been extraordinarily good?" "Do you feel good?" "More than good," she laughed. "Christian-like. Aren't we told in the New Testament to forgive our enemies?" "And love those that despitefully use us," I misquoted maliciously. A sudden gust of anger often causes us to do worse things than trifle with the text of the Sermon on the Mount. She turned on me quickly, as though stung. "Why not? Isn't the sight of him maimed like that enough to melt the heart of a stone?" I replied soberly enough: "It is indeed." I had already betrayed my foolish jealousy. Further altercation could only result in my betraying Boyce. I did not feel very happy. Conscious of having spoken to me with unwonted sharpness, she sought to make amends by laying her hand on my shoulder. "I think, dear," she said, "we're all on rather an emotional edge to-day." We reached the front door of the hall. At the top of the shallow flight of broad stairs the little group that had preceded us stood behind Boyce, who was receiving the cheers of the troops, soldiers and volunteers and the Godbury School Officers' Training Corps, drawn up in the market square. When the cheers died away the crowd raised cries for a speech. Again Boyce spoke. "The reception you have given my mother and myself," he said, "we refuse to take personally. It is a reception given to the soldiers and the mothers and wives of soldiers of the Empire, of whom we just happen to be the lucky representatives. Whole regiments, to say nothing of whole armies, can't all, every jack man, receive Victoria Crosses; but every regiment very jealously counts up its honours. You'll hear men say, 'Our regiment has 2 V.C.'s, 5 D.S.O.'s, and 20 Distinguished Conduct Medals; and the feeling is that all the honours are lumped together and shared by everybody, from the colonel to the drummer boys. And each individual is proud of his share because he knows that he deserves it. And so it happens that those whom chance has set aside for distinction, like the lucky winners in a sweepstake, are the most embarrassed people you can imagine, because everybody is doing everything that they did every day in the week. For instance, if I began to tell you 1,000th part of the dare-devil deeds of my friend here, Captain Winslow of my regiment, he would bolt like a rabbit into the town hall, and fall on his knees and pray for an earthquake. And whether the earthquake came off or not, I'm sure he would never speak to me again. And they're all like that. But in honouring me you are honouring him, and you're honouring our regiment, and you're honouring the army. And in honouring Mrs. Boyce, you are honouring that wonderful womanhood of the Empire that is standing heroically behind their men in the hell upon God's good earth which is known as the Front." It was a soldier-like little speech, delivered with the man's gallant charm. Young Winslow gripped his arm affectionately, and I heard him say, "You are a brute, sir, dragging me into it." The little party descended the steps of the town hall. The words of command rang out. The parade stood at the salute, which Boyce acknowledged. Guided by Winslow and his mother, he reached his car, to which he was attended by the Mayor and Mayoress. After formal leave-taking, the Boyces and Winslow drove off, amid the plaudits of the crowd. Then Sir Anthony and Lady Fenimore. Then Betty and her aunts. Last of all, while the troops were preparing to march away, and the crowd was dispersing, and all the excitement was over, Marigold picked me out of my chair and carried me down to my little grey two-seater. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Red Planet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Red Planet by William J. Locke. Chapter 21. Of course, after this, in the words of my young friends, I crocked up. The confounded shell that had played the fool with my legs had also done something silly to my heart. Hence these collapses after physical and emotional strain. I had to stay in bed for some days. Cliff told me that as soon as I was fit to travel I must go to Bournemouth, where it would be warm. I told Cliff to go to a place where it would be warmer. As neither of us would obey the other, we remained where we were. Cliff informed me that Lady Fenimore had called him in to see Sir Anthony, whom she described as being on the obstinate edge of a nervous breakdown. I was sorry to hear it. "I suppose you've tried to send him too to Bournemouth?" "I haven't," Cliff replied gravely. "He has got something on his mind, I'm sure of it. So is his wife. What's the good of sending him away?" "What do you think is on his mind?" I asked. "How do I know? His wife thinks it must be something to do with Boyce's reception. He went home dead beat, and is very irritable, off his food, can't sleep, and swears cantankerously that there's nothing the matter with him. The usual symptoms. Can you throw any light on it?" "Certainly not," I replied, rather sharply. Cliff said "Humph!" in his exasperating professional way, and proceeded to feel my pulse. "I don't quite see how Friday's mild exertion could account for your breakdown, my friend," he remarked. "I'm so glad you confess at last not to seeing everything," said I. I was fearing this physical reaction in Sir Anthony. It was only the self-assertion of nature. He had gone splendidly through his ordeal, having braced himself up for it. He had not braced himself up, however, sufficiently to go through the other and far longer ordeal of hiding his secret from his wife. So of course he went to pieces. After Cliff had left me, with his desire for information unsatisfied, I rang up Wellings Park. It was the Sunday morning after the reception. To my surprise, Sir Anthony answered me; for he was an old-fashioned country church-goer, and plague, pestilence, famine, battle, murder, and sudden death had never been known to keep him out of his accustomed pew on Sunday morning. Edith, he informed me, had gone to church. He himself, being as nervous as a cat, had funked it. He was afraid lest he might get up in the middle of the sermon and curse the vicar. "If that's so," said I, "come round here and talk sense. I've something important to say to you." He agreed, and shortly afterwards he arrived. I was shocked to see him. His ruddy face had yellowed, and the firm flesh had loosened and sagged. I had never noticed that his stubbly hair was so grey. He could scarcely sit still on the chair by my bedside. I told him of Cliff's suspicions. We were a pair of conspirators with unavowable things on our minds which were driving us to nervous catastrophe. Edith, said I, was more suspicious even than Cliff. I also told him of our talk about the projected dinner party. That, he declared, would drive me stark, staring mad. "So will continuing to hide the truth from Edith," said I. "How do you suppose you can carry on like this?" He grew angry. How could he tell Edith? How could he make her understand his reason for welcoming Boyce? How could he prevent her from blazing the truth abroad and crying aloud for vengeance? What kind of a fool's counsel was I giving him? I let him talk until, tired with reiteration, he had nothing more to say. Then I made him listen to me while I expounded that which was familiar to his obstinate mind, namely, the heroic qualities of his own wife. "It comes to this," said I, by way of peroration, "that you're afraid of Edith letting you down, and you ought to be ashamed of yourself." At that he flared out again. How dared I, he asked, eating his words, suggest that he did not trust the most splendid woman God had ever made? Didn't I see that he was only trying to shield her from knowledge that might kill her? I retorted by pointing out that worry over his insane behaviour, please remember that above our deep unchangeable mutual affection a violent surface quarrel was raging, would more surely and swiftly kill her than unhappy knowledge. Her quick brain had already connected Gedge, Boyce, and his present condition as the main factors of some strange problem. "Her quick brain!" I cried. "A half-idiot child would have put things together." Presently he collapsed, sitting hopelessly, nervelessly, in his chair. At last he lifted a piteously humble face. "What would you suggest my doing, Duncan?" There seemed to me to be only one thing he could do in order to preserve, if not his reason, at any rate his moral equilibrium in the position which he had contrived for himself. To tell him this had been my object in seeking the interview, and the blessed opportunity only came after an hour's hard wrangle, in current metaphor, after an hour's artillery preparation for attack. He looked so battered, poor old Antony, that I felt almost ashamed of the success of my bombardment. "It's not a question of suggesting," said I. "It's a question of things that have to be done. You need a holiday. You've been working here at high pressure for nearly a couple of years. Go away. Put yourself in the hands of Cliff, and go to Bournemouth or Biarritz or Bahia, or any beastly place you can fix up with him to go. Go, frankly, for 3 or 4 months. Go tomorrow. As soon as you're well out of the place, tell Edith the whole story. Then you can take counsel and comfort together." He was in the state of mind to be impressed by my argument. I followed up my advantage. I undertook to send a ruthless flaming angel of a Cliff to pronounce the inexorable decree of exile. After a few faint-hearted objections, he acquiesced in the scheme. I fancy he revolted against even this apparent surrender to Gedge, although he was too proud to confess it. No man likes running away. Sir Anthony also regarded as pusillanimous the proposal to leave his wife in ignorance until he had led her into the trap of a holiday. Why not put her into his confidence before they started? "That," said I, "is a delicate question which only you yourself can decide. By following my plan you get away at once, which is the most important thing. Once comfortably away, you can choose the opportune moment." "There's something in that," he replied; and, after thanking me for my advice, he left me. I do not defend my plan. I admit it was Machiavellian. My one desire was to remove these two dear people from Wellingsford for a season. Just think of the horrible impossibility of their maintaining social relations with the Boyces. By publicly honouring Boyce, Sir Anthony had tied his own hands. It was a pledge to Boyce, although the latter did not know it, of condonation. Whatever stories Gedge might spread abroad, whatever proofs he might display, Sir Anthony could take no action. But to carry on a semblance of friendship with the man responsible for his daughter's death, for the two of them, mind you, since Lady Fenimore would sooner or later learn everything, was, as I say, horribly impossible. Let them go, then, on their nominal holiday, during which the air might clear. Boyce might take his mother away from Wellingsford. She would do far more than uproot herself from her home in order to gratify the wish of her adored and blinded son. He would employ his time of darkness in learning to be brave, he had told me. It took some courage to face the associations of dreadful memories unflinchingly for his mother's sake. Should he learn, however, that the Fenimores had an inkling of the truth, he would recognize his presence in the place to be an outrage. And such an inkling, who would give it him? Perhaps I myself. The Boyces would go, the Fenimores could return. Anything, anything rather than that the Fenimores and the Boyces should continue to dwell in the same little town. And there was Betty, with all the inexplicable feminine whirring inside her, socially reconciled with Boyce. Where the deuce was this reconciliation going to lead? I have told you how my lunatic love for Betty had stood revealed to me. Had she chosen to love and marry any ordinary gallant gentleman, God knows I should not have had a word to say. The love that such as I can give a woman can find its only true expression in desiring and contriving her happiness. But that she should sway back to Leonard Boyce, no, no, I could not bear it. All the shuddering pictures of him rose up before me, the last, that of him standing by the Locke gates, and suddenly running like a frightened rabbit, with his jaunty soft felt hat squashed shapelessly over his ears. Gedge could not have invented that abominable touch of the squashed hat. I have said that possibly I myself might give Boyce an inkling of the truth. Thinking over the matter in my restless bed, I shrank from doing so. Should I not be disingenuously serving my own ends? Betty stepped in, whom I wanted for myself. Neither could I go to Boyce and challenge him for a villain, and summon him to quit the town, and leave those dear to me at peace. I could not condemn him. I had unshaken faith in the man's noble qualities. That he drowned Althea Fenimore I did not, could not believe. After all that had passed between us, I felt my loyalty to him irrevocably pledged. More than ever was I enmeshed in the net of the man's destiny. As yet, however, I could not bear to see him. I could not bear to see Betty, who called now and then. For the first time in my life I took refuge in my invalidity, whereby I earned the commendation of Cliffe. Betty sent me flowers. Mrs. Boyce sent me grapes and an infallible prescription for heart attacks, which, owing to the hopeless mess she had made in trying to copy the wriggles indicating the quantities of the various drugs, was of no practical use. Phyllis Gedge sent me a few bunches of violets with a shy little note. Lady Fenimore wrote me an affectionate letter bidding me farewell. They were going to Bude in Cornwall, Anthony having put himself under Dr. Cliffe's orders like a wonderful lamb. When she came back she hoped that her two sick men would be restored to health and able to look more favourably upon her projected dinner party. Marigold also brought into my bedroom a precious old Waterford claret jug which I had loved and secretly coveted for 20 years, with a card attached bearing the inscription, "With love from Anthony." That was his dumb British way of informing me that he was taking my advice. When my self-respect would allow me no longer to remain in bed, I got up, but I still shrank from publishing the news of my recovery, in which reluctance I met with the hearty encouragement both of Cliffe and Marigold. The doctor then informed me that my attack of illness had been very much more serious than I realized, and that unless I made up my mind to lead the most unruffled of cabbage-like existences, he would not answer for what might befall me. If he could have his way, he would carry me off and put me into solitary confinement for a couple of months on a sunny island, where I should hold no communication with the outside world. Marigold heard this announcement with smug satisfaction. Nothing would please him more than to play jailer over me. At last one morning I said to him, "I'm not going to submit to tyranny any longer. I resume my normal life. I'm at home to anybody who calls. I'm at home to the devil himself." "Very good, sir," said Marigold. An hour or two afterwards the door was thrown open, and there stood on the threshold the most amazing apparition that ever sought admittance into a gentleman's library. An apparition, however, very familiar, during these days, to English eyes. From the shapeless tam o' shanter to the huge boots it was caked in mud. Over a filthy sheepskin were slung all kinds of paraphernalia, covered with dirty canvas, which made it look a thing of mighty bulges, among which a rifle was poked away. It wore a kilt covered by a khaki apron. It also had a dirty and unshaven face. A muddy warrior, fresh from the trenches, of course. But what was he doing here? "I see, sir, you don't recognize me," he said with a smile. "Good Lord!" I cried with a start. "It's Randall!" "Yes, sir. May I come in?" "Come in? What infernal nonsense are you talking?" I held out my hand and, after greeting him, made him sit down. "Now," said I, "what the deuce are you doing in that kit?" "That's what I've been asking myself for the last 10 months. Anyhow, I shan't wear it much longer. How's that?" "Commission, sir," he answered. "Oh," said I. His entrance had been so abrupt and unexpected that I hardly knew as yet what to make of him. Speculation as to his doings had led me to imagine him engaged in some elegant fancy occupation on the fringe of the army, if indeed he were serving his country so creditably. I found it hard to reconcile my conception of Master Randall Holmes with this businesslike Tommy who called me "sir" every minute. "I'll tell you about it, sir, if you're interested. But first, how is my mother?" "Your mother? You haven't seen her yet?" Here, at least, was a bit of the old casual Randall. He shook his head. "I've only just this minute arrived. Left the trenches yesterday. Walked from the station. Not a soul recognized me. I thought I had better come here first and report, just as I was, and not wait until I had washed and shaved and put on Christian clothes again." He looked at me and grinned. "Seeing is believing." "Your mother is quite well," said I. "Haven't you given her any warning of your arrival?" "Oh, no," he answered. "I didn't want any brass bands. Besides, as I say, I wanted to see you first, then to look in at the hospital. I suppose Phyllis Gedge is still at the hospital?" "She is. But I think, my dear chap, your mother has the first call on you." "She wouldn't enjoy my present abominable appearance as much as Phyllis," he replied coolly. "You see, Phyllis is responsible for it. I told you she refused to marry me, didn't I, sir? After that she called me a coward. I had to show her that I wasn't one. It was an awful nuisance, I admit, for I had intended to do something quite different. Oh, not gedging or anything of that sort, but—" He dived beneath his sheepskin and brought out a tattered letter case, and from a mass of greasy documents, shades of superior Oxford, selected a dirty, ragged bit of newspaper. "But," said he, handing me the fragment, "I think I've succeeded. I don't suppose this caught your eye, but if you look closely into it you'll see that 11003 Private R. Holmes, 1st Gordon Highlanders, a couple of months ago was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. I may be any kind of a fool or knave she likes to call me, but she can't call me a coward." I congratulated him with all my heart, which, after the first shock, was warming towards him rapidly. "But why," I asked, still somewhat bewildered, "didn't you apply for a commission? A year ago you could have got one easily. Why enlist? And the 1st Gordons! That's the regular army." He laughed and asked permission to help himself to a cigarette. "By George, that's good!" he exclaimed, after a few puffs. "That's good after months of Woodbines. I found I could stand everything except Tommy's cigarettes. Everything about me has got as hard as nails except my palate for tobacco. Why didn't I apply for a commission? Any fool could get a commission. It's different now. Men are picked and must have seen active service, and then they're sent off to Cadet Training Corps. But last year I could have got one easily, and I might have been kicking my heels about England now." "Yet at the sight of a Sam Browne belt, Phyllis would surely have recanted," said I. "I didn't want the girl I intended to marry and pass my life with to have her head turned by such trappings as a Sam Browne belt. She has had to be taught that she is going to marry a man. I'm not such a fool as you may have thought me, Major," he said, forgetful of his humble rank. "Suppose I had got a commission and married her. Suppose I had been kept at home and never gone out and never seen a shot fired, like heaps of other fellows. Or suppose I had taken the line I had marked out. Do you think we should have been assured a happy life? Not a bit of it. We might have been happy for 20 years. And then, women are women and can't help themselves, the old word, by George, sir, she spat it at me from a festering sore in her very soul, the old word would have rankled all the time, and some stupid quarrel having arisen, she would have spat it at me again. I wasn't taking any chances of that kind." "My dear boy," said I, subridently, "you seem to be very wise." And he did. So far as I knew anything about humans, male and female, his proposition was incontrovertible. "But where did you gather your wisdom?" "I suppose," he replied seriously, "that my mind is not entirely unaffected by a very expensive education." I looked at the extraordinary figure in sheepskin, bundles, and mud, and laughed out loud. The hands of Esau and the voice of Jacob. the garb of Thomas Atkins, and the voice of Baliol. Still, as I say, the fellow was perfectly right. His highly trained intelligence had led him to an exact conclusion. The festering sore demanded drastic treatment, the surgeon's knife. As we talked, I saw how coldly his brain had worked. And side by side with that working, I saw, to my amusement, the insistent claims of his vanity. The quickest way to the front, where alone he could re-establish his impugned honor, was by enlistment in the regular army. For the first time in his life he took a grip on essentials. He knew that by going straight into the heart of the old army his brains, provided they remained in his head, would enable him to accomplish his purpose. As for his choice of regiment, there his vanity guided. You may remember that after his disappearance we first heard of him at Aberdeen. Now Aberdeen is the depot of the Gordon Highlanders. "What on earth made you go there?" I asked. "I wanted to get among a crowd where I wasn't known, and wasn't ever likely to be known," he replied, "and my instinct was right. I was among farmers from Skye, and butchers from Inverness, and drunken scallywags from the slums of Aberdeen, and a leaven of old soldiers from all over Scotland. I had no idea that such people existed. At first I thought I shouldn't be able to stick it. They gave me a bad time for being an Englishman. But soon I think they rather liked me. I set my brains to work and made 'em like me. I knew there was everything to learn about these fellows, and I went scientifically to work to learn it. And by heaven, sir, when once they accepted me, I found I had never been in such splendid company in my life." "My dear boy," I cried in a burst of enthusiasm, "have you had breakfast?" "Of course I have, at the Union Jack Club, the Tommies' place the other side of the river. Bacon and eggs and sausages. I thought I'd never stop eating." "Have some more?" He laughed. "Couldn't think of it." "Then," said I, "get yourself a cigar." I pointed to a stack of boxes. "You'll find the Corona. Corona's the best. As I am not a millionaire, I don't offer these Coronas to everybody. I myself can only afford to smoke 1 or 2 a week." When he had lit it, he said, "I was led away from what I wanted to tell you. My going to Aberdeen and plunging into the obscurity of a Scottish regiment. I was absolutely determined that none of my friends, none of you good people, should know what an ass I had made of myself. That's why I kept it from my mother. She would have blabbed it all over the place." "But, my good fellow," said I, "why the dickens shouldn't we have known? That I was making an ass of myself?" "No, you young idiot," I cried, "that you were making a man of yourself." "I preferred to wait," said he coolly, "until I had a reasonable certainty that I had achieved that consummation, or rather something that might stand for it in the prejudiced eyes of my dear friends. I knew that you all, ultimately, you and mother and Phyllis, would judge by results. Well, here they are. I've lived the life of a Tommy for 10 months. I've been 5 in the thick of it over there. I've refused stripes over and over again. I've got my D.C.M. I've got my commission through the ranks, practically on the field. And of the draft of 200 men who went out with me, only one other and myself remain." "It's a splendid record, my boy," said I. He rose. "Don't misunderstand me, Major. I'm not bragging. God forbid. I'm only wanting to explain why I kept dark all the time, and why I'm springing smugly and complacently on you now." "I quite understand," said I. "In that case," he laughed, "I can proceed on my rounds." But he did not proceed. He lingered. "There's another matter I should like to mention," he said. "In her last letter my mother told me that the Mayor and Town Council were on the point of giving a civic reception to Colonel Boyce. Has it taken place yet?" "Yes," said I. "And did it go off all right?" In spite of wisdom learned at Balliol and shell craters, he was still an ingenuous youth. "Gedge was perfectly quiet," I answered. He started, as he had for months learned not to start, and into his eyes sprang an alarm that was usually foreign to them. "Gedge? How do you know anything about Gedge and Colonel Boyce? Good Lord, he hasn't been spreading that poisonous stuff over the town?" "That's what you were afraid of when you asked about the reception?" "Of course," said he. "And you wanted to have your mind clear on the point before interviewing Phyllis." "You're quite right, sir," he replied, a bit shamefacedly. "But if he hasn't been spreading it, how do you know it? And," he looked at me sharply, "what do you know?" "You gave your word of honour not to repeat what Gedge told you. I think you may be absolved of your promise. Gedge came to Sir Anthony and myself with a lying story about the death of Althea Fenimore." "Yes," said he, "that was it." "Sit down for another minute or two," said I, "and let us compare notes." He obeyed. We compared notes. I found that in most essentials the two stories were identical, although Gedge had been maudlin drunk when he admitted Randall into his confidence. "But in pitching you his yarn," cried Randall, "he left out the blackmail. He bragged in his beastly way that Colonel Boyce was worth 1,000 a year to him, all he had to live upon now that the bloodsuckers had ruined his business. Then he began to weep and slobber, he was a disgusting sight, and he said he would give it all up and beg with his daughter in the streets as soon as he had an opportunity of unmasking that shocking wicked fellow." "What did you say then?" I asked. "I told him if I ever heard of him spreading such infernal lies abroad, I'd wring his neck." "Very good, my boy," said I. "That's practically what Sir Anthony told him." "Sir Anthony doesn't believe there's any truth in it." "Sir Anthony," said I boldly, "knows there's not a particle of truth in it. The man's malignancy has taken the form of a fixed idea. He's crack-brained. Between us we put the fear of God into him, and I don't think he'll give any more trouble." Randall got to his feet again. "I'm very much relieved to hear you say so. I must confess I've been horribly uneasy about the whole thing." He drew a deep breath. "Thank goodness I can go to Phyllis, as you say, with a clear mind. The last time I saw her I was half crazy." He held out his hand, a dirty, nubbly, ragged-nailed hand, the hand that was once so irritatingly manicured. "Good bye, Major. You won't shut the door on me now, will you?" I wrung his hand hard and bade him not be silly, and looking up at him said: "What was the other thing quite different you were intending to do before you, let us say, quarrelled with Phyllis?" He hesitated, his forehead knit in a little web of perplexity. "Whatever it was," I continued, "let us have it. I'm your oldest friend, a sort of father. Be frank with me, and you won't regret it. The splendid work you've done has wiped out everything." "I'm afraid it has," said he ruefully. "Wiped it out clean." With a hitch of the shoulders he settled his pack more comfortably. "Well, I'll tell you, Major. I thought I had brains. I still think I have. I was on the point of getting a job in the Secret Service, Intelligence Department. I had the whole thing cut and dried, to get at the ramifications of German espionage in socialistic and so-called intellectual circles in neutral and other countries. It would have been ticklish work, for I should have been carrying my life in my hands. I could have done it well. I started out by being a sort of intellectual myself. All along I wanted to put my brains at the service of my country. I took some time to hit upon the real way. I hit upon it. I learned lots of things from Gedge. If he weren't an arrant coward, he might be dangerous. He would be taking German money long ago, but that he's frightened to death of it." He laughed. "It never occurred to you, I suppose, a year ago," he continued, "that I spent most of my days in London working like a horse?" "But," I cried, I felt myself flushing purple, and when I flush purple the unregenerate old soldier in me uses language of a corresponding hue. "But," I cried, and in this language I asked him why he had told me nothing about it. "The essence of the Secret Service, sir," replied this maddening young man, "is, well, secrecy. You had a billet offered to you of the kind you describe?" "The offer reached me, very much belated, one day when I was half dead after having performed some humiliating fatigue duty. I think I had persisted in trying to scratch an itching back on parade. Military discipline, I need not tell you, Major, doesn't take into account the sensitiveness of a recruit's back. It flatly denies such a phenomenon. Now I think I can defy anything in God's quaint universe to make me itch. But that's by the way. I tore the letter up and never answered it. You do these things, sir, when the whole universe seems to be a stumbling block and an offence. Phyllis was the stumbling block, and the rest of the cosmos was the other thing. That's why I have reason on my side when I say that, all through Phyllis Gedge, I made an ass of myself." He clutched his rude coat with both hands, an ass in sheep's clothing. He drew himself up, saluted, and marched out. He marched out, the young scoundrel, with all the honors of war. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Red Planet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Red Planet by William J. Locke. Chapter 22. So, in drawing a bow at a venture, I had hit the mark. You may remember that I had rapped out the word blackmail at Gedge. Now Randall justified the charge. Boyce was worth 1,000 a year to him. The more I speculated on the danger that might arise from Gedge, the easier I grew in my mind. Your blackmailer is a notorious saver of his skin. Gedge had no desire to bring Boyce to justice and thereby incriminate himself. His visit to Sir Anthony was actuated by sheer malignity. Without doubt he counted on his story being believed, but he knew enough of the hated and envied aristocracy to feel assured that Sir Anthony would not subject his beloved dead to such ghastly disinterment as a public denunciation of Boyce would necessitate. He desired to throw an asphyxiating bomb into the midst of our private circle. He reckoned on the mayor taking some action that would stop the reception, and thereby put a public affront on Boyce. Sir Anthony's violent indignation, and perhaps my appearance of cold incredulity, upset his calculations. He went out of the room a defeated man, with a secret load, as I knew now, of blackmail on his shoulders. I snapped my fingers at Gedge. Randall seemed to do the same, undesirable father-in-law in prospectu as he was. But that was entirely Randall's affair. The stomach that he had for fighting with Germans would stand him in good stead against Gedge, especially as he had formed so contemptuous an estimate of the latter's valour. I emerged again into my little world. I saw most of my friends. Phyllis lay in wait for me at the hospital, radiant and blushing, ostensibly to congratulate me on recovery from my illness, really, little baggage, to hear from my lips a word or two in praise of Randall. Apparently he had come in his warrior garb, seen, and conquered on the spot. I saw Mrs. Holmes, who, gladdened by the Distinguished Conduct Medalist's return, had wiped from her memory his abominably unfilial behaviour. I saw Betty, and I saw Boyce. Now here I come to a point in this chronicle where I am faced by an appalling difficulty. Hitherto I have striven to tell you no more about myself and my motives and feelings than was demanded by my purpose of unfolding to you the lives of others. Primarily I wanted to explain Leonard Boyce. I could only do it by showing you how he reacted on myself, myself being an unimportant and uninteresting person. It was all very well when I could stand aside and dispassionately analyze such reactions. The same with regard to my dear Betty. But now, if I adopted the same method of telling you the story of Betty and the story of Boyce, the method of reaction, so to speak, I should be merely whining into your ears the dolorous tale of Duncan Meredith, paralytic and idiot. The deuce of it is that for a long time nothing particular or definite happened. So how can I describe to you a very important period in the lives of Betty and Boyce and me? I had to resume my intimacy with Boyce. The blind and lonely man craved it and claimed it. It would be an unmeaning pretence of modesty to underestimate the value to him of my friendship. He was a man of intense feelings. Torture had closed his heart to the troops of friends that so distinguished a soldier might have had. He granted admittance but to three: his mother, Betty, and, for some unaccountable reason, myself. On us he concentrated all the strength of his affection. Mind you, it was not a case of a maimed creature clinging for support to those who cared for him. In his intercourse with me he never for a moment suggested that he was seeking help or solace in his affliction. On the contrary, he ruled it out of the conditions of social life. He was as brave as you please. In his laughing scorn of blindness he was the bravest man I have ever known. He learned the confidence of the blind with marvellous facility. His path through darkness was a triumphant march. Sometimes, when he refought old battles and planned new ones, forecast the strategy of the great advance, word painted scenes and places, drew character sketches of great leaders and quaint men, I forgot the tragedy of Althea Fenimore. And when the memory came swiftly back, I wondered whether, after all, Gedge's story, from first to last, had not been a malevolent invention. The man seemed so happy. Of course you will say it was my duty to give a hint of Gedge's revelation. It was. To my shame, I shirked it. I could not find it in my heart suddenly to dash into his happiness. I awaited an opportunity, a change of mood in him, an allusion to confidences of which I alone of human beings had been the recipient. Betty visited me as usual. We talked war and hospital and local gossip for a while, and then she seemed to take refuge at the piano. We had one red letter day when a sailor cousin of hers, fresh from the North Sea, came to luncheon and told us wonders of the Navy which we had barely imagined and did not dare to hope for. His tidings gave subject for many a talk. I knew that she was seeing Boyce constantly. The former acquaintance of the elders of the two houses flamed into sudden friendship. From a remark artlessly let fall by Mrs. Boyce, I gathered that the old ladies were deliberately contriving such meetings. Boyce and Betty referred to each other rarely and casually, but enough to show me that the old feud was at an end. And of what save one thing could the end of a feud between lovers be the beginning? What did she know? Knowing all, how could she be drawn back under the man's fascination? The question maddened me. I suffered terribly. At last, one evening, I could bear it no longer. She was playing Chopin. The music grated on me. I called out to her, "Betty!" She broke off and turned round with a smile of surprise. Again she was wearing the old black evening dress in which I have told you she looked so beautiful. "No more music, dear. Come and talk to me." She crossed the room with her free step and sat near my chair. "What shall I talk about?" she laughed. "Leonard Boyce." The laughter left her face, and she gave me a swift glance. "Majy dear, I'd rather not," she said, with a little air of finality. "I know that," said I. "I also know that in your eyes I am committing an unwarrantable impertinence." "Not at all," she replied politely. "You have the right to talk to me for my good. It's impertinence in me not to wish to hear it." "Betty dear," said I, "will you tell me what was the cause of your estrangement?" She stiffened. "No one has the right to ask me that." "A man who loves you very, very dearly," said I, "will claim it." Was the cause Althea Fenimore?" She looked at me almost in frightened amazement. "Is that mere guesswork?" "No, dear," said I quietly. "I thought no one knew, except one person. I was not even sure that Leonard Boyce was aware that I knew." Another bow at a venture. "That one person is Gedge." "You're right. I suppose he has been talking," she said, greatly agitated. "He has been putting it about all over the place. I've been dreading it." Then she sprang to her feet and drew herself up and snapped her fingers in an heroical way. "And if he has said that Althea Fenimore drowned herself for love of Leonard Boyce, what is there in it? After all, what has Leonard Boyce done that he can't be forgiven? Men are men and women are women. We've tried for tens of thousands of years to lay down hard and fast lines for the sexes to walk upon, and we've failed miserably. Suppose Leonard Boyce did make love to Althea Fenimore, trifle with her affections in the old-fashioned phrase. What then? I'm greatly to blame. It has only lately been brought home to me. Instead of staying here while we were engaged, I would have my last fling as an emancipated young woman in London. He consoled himself with Althea. When she found he meant nothing, she threw herself into the canal. It was dreadful. It was tragic. He went away and broke with me. I didn't discover the reason till months afterwards. She drowned herself for love of him, it's true. But what was his share in it that he can't be forgiven for? Millions of men have been forgiven by women for passing loves. Why not he? Why not a tremendous man like him, a man who has paid every penalty for wrong, if wrong there was? Blind." She walked about and threw up her hands and halted in front of my chair. "I'll own that until lately I accused him of unforgivable sin, deceiving me and making love to another girl and driving her to suicide. I tore him out of my heart and married Willie. We won't speak of that. But since he has come back, things seem different. His mother has told me that one day when he was asleep she found he was still wearing his identification disc. There was an old faded photograph of me on the other side. It had been there all through the war. You see," she added, after a pause, during which her heaving bosom and quivering lip made her maddeningly lovely, "I don't care a brass button for anything that Gedge may say." And that was all my clean-souled Betty knew about it. She had no idea of deeper faithlessness, no suspicion of Boyce's presence with Althea on the bank of the canal. She stood pathetic in her half-knowledge. My heart ached. From her pure woman's point of view she had been justified in her denunciation of Boyce. He had left her without a word. A wall of silence came between them. Then she learned the reason. He had trifled with a young girl's affections, and out of despair she had drowned herself. But how had she learned? I had to question her. It was then that she told me the story of Phyllis and her father, to which I have made previous allusion. How Phyllis, as her father's secretary, had opened a letter which had frightened her. How her father's crafty face had frightened her still more. How she had run to Betty for the easing of her heart. And this letter was from Leonard Boyce. "I cannot afford one penny more," so the letter ran, according to Betty's recollection of Phyllis's recollection. "But if you remain loyal to our agreement, you will not regret it. If ever I hear of your coupling my name with that of Miss Fenimore, I'll kill you. I am a man of my word." I think Betty crystallized Phyllis's looser statement, but the exact wording was immaterial. Here was Boyce branding himself with complicity in the tragedy of Althea, and paying Gedge to keep it dark. Like Sir Anthony, Betty remembered trivial things that assumed grave significance. There was no room for doubt. Catastrophe following on his villainy had kept Boyce away from Wellingsford, had terrified him out of his engagement. And so her heart had grown bitter against him. You may ask why her knowledge of the world had not led her to suspect blacker wrong, for a man does not pay blackmail because he has led a romantic girl into a wrong notion of the extent of his affection. My only answer is that Betty was Betty, clean-hearted and clean-souled, like the young Artemis she resembled. And now she proclaimed that he had expiated his offence. She proclaimed her renewed and passionate interest in the man. I saw that deep down in her heart she had always loved him. After telling me about Phyllis, she returned to the point where she had broken off. She supposed that Gedge had been talking all over the place. "I don't think so, dear," said I. "So far as I know, he has only spoken first to Randall Holmes, that was what made him break away from Gedge, whose society he had been cultivating for other reasons than those I imagined. You remember telling me Phyllis's sorrowful little tale last year?" She nodded. "And secondly to Sir Anthony and myself, a few hours before the reception." She clenched her fists and broke out again. "The devil! The incarnate devil! And Sir Anthony?" Pretended to treat Gedge's story as a lie, threw into the fire without reading it an incriminating letter, possibly the letter that Phyllis saw, ordered Gedge out of the house, and, like a great gentleman, went through the ceremony. "Does Leonard know?" "Not that I'm aware of," said I. "He must be told. It's terrible to have an enemy waiting to stab you in the dark, and you blind to boot. Why haven't you told him?" Why? It was so hard to keep to the lower key of her conception of things. I made a little gesture signifying I know not what, that it was not my business, that I was not on sufficient terms of intimacy with Boyce, that it didn't seem important enough. My helpless shrug suggested, I suppose, all of these excuses. Why hadn't I warned him? Cowardice, I suppose. "Either you or I must do it," she went on. "You're his friend. He thinks more of you than of any other man in the world. And he's right, dear." She flashed me a proud glance, sweet and stabbing. "Don't I know it?" Then suddenly a new idea seemed to pass through her brain. She bent forward and touched the light shawl covering my knees. "For the last month or two you've known what he has done. It hasn't made any difference in your friendship. You must think with me that the past is past, that he has purged his sins, or whatever you like to call them, that he is a man greatly to be forgiven." "Yes, dear," said I, with a show of bravery, though I dreaded lest my voice should break. "I think he is a man to be forgiven." Her logic was remorseless. With her frank grace she threw herself in her old attitude by the side of my chair. "I'm so glad we have had this talk, Majy darling. It has made everything between us so clear and beautiful. It is always such a grief to me to think you may not understand. I shall always be the little girl that looked upon you as a wonderful hero and divine dispenser of chocolates. Only now the chocolates stand for love and forbearance and sympathy and all kinds of spiritual goodies." I passed my hand over her hair. "Silly child!" "I got it into my head," she continued, "that you were blaming me for my reconciliation with Leonard. But, my dear, what woman's heart wouldn't be turned to water at the sight of him? It makes me so happy that you understand. I can't tell you how happy." "Are you going to marry him?" I think my voice was steady and kind enough. "Possibly some day if he asks me." I still stroked her hair. "I wouldn't let it be too soon," said I. Her eyes were downcast. "On account of Willie?" she murmured. "No, dear, I don't dare touch on that side of things." Again a whisper. "Why, then?" How could I tell her why without betrayal of Boyce? I had to turn the question playfully. I said, "What should I do without my Betty?" "Do you really care about me so much?" I laughed. There are times when one has to laugh, or overwhelm oneself in dishonour. "Now you see my nature in all its vile egotism," said I, and the statement led to a pretty quarrel. But after it was over to our joint satisfaction, she had to return to the distressful main theme of our talk. She harked back to Sir Anthony, touched on his splendid behaviour, recalled, with a little dismay, the hitherto unnoted fact that after the ceremony he had held himself aloof from those that thronged round Boyce. Then, without hint from me, she perceived the significance of the Fenimores' retirement from Wellingsford. "Leonard's ignorance," she said, "leaves him in a frightful position. More than ever, he ought to know." "He ought indeed, my dear," said I, "and I will tell him. I ought to have done so before." I gave my undertaking. I went to bed upbraiding myself for cowardice, and resolved to go to Boyce the next day. Not only fate, but honor and decency forced me to the detested task. Alas! Next morning I was nailed to my bed by my abominable malady. The attacks had become more frequent of late. Cliffe administered restoratives, and for the first time he lost his smile and looked worried. You see, until quite lately I had had a very tranquil life, deeply interested in other folks' joys and sorrows, but moved by very few of my own. And now there had swooped down on me this ravening pack of emotions which were tearing me to pieces. I lay for a couple of days tortured by physical pain, humiliation, and mental anguish. On the evening of the second day, Marigold came into the bedroom with a puzzled look on his face. "Colonel Boyce is here, sir. I told him you were in bed and seeing nobody, but he says he wants to see you on something important. I asked him whether it couldn't wait till tomorrow, and he said that if I would give you a password, Vilboek's Farm, you'd be sure to see him." "Quite right, Marigold," said I. "Show him in." Vilboek's Farm. Fate had driven him to me instead of me to him. I would see him though it killed me, and get the horrible business over for ever. Marigold led him in and drew up a chair for him by the bedside, after pulling on the lights and drawing the curtains, for the warm May evening was drawing to a close. "Anything more, sir, for the present?" he asked. "Could I have the materials for a whisky and soda to hand?" said Boyce. "Of course," said I. Marigold departed. Boyce said, "If you're too ill to stand me, send me away. But if you can stand me, for God's sake let me talk to you." "Talk as much as you like," said I. "This is only one of my stupid attacks which a man without legs has to put up with." "But Marigold " "Marigold's an old hen," said I. "Are you sure you're well enough? That's the curse of not being able to see. Tell me frankly." "I'm quite sure," said I. "I have never been able to get over the curious embarrassment of talking to a man whose eyes I cannot see. The black spectacles seemed to be like a wall behind which the man hid his thoughts. I watched his lips. Once or twice the odd little twitch had appeared at the corners. Even with his baffling black spectacles he looked a gallant figure of a man. He was precisely dressed in perfectly fitting dinner jacket and neat black tie, well groomed from the points of his patent leather shoes to his trim, crisp brown hair. And beneath this scrupulousness of attire lay the suggestion of great strength. Marigold brought in the tray with decanter, siphon, and glasses, and put them on a table, together with cigars and cigarettes, by his side. After a few deft touches, so as to identify the objects, Boyce smiled and nodded at Marigold. "Thanks very much, Sergeant," he said. If there is one thing Marigold loves, it is to be addressed as Sergeant. Marigold might indicate a butler, but Sergeant means a sergeant. "Perhaps I might fetch the Colonel a more comfortable chair, sir," said he. But Boyce laughed. "No, no," and Marigold left us. Boyce's ear listened for the click of the door. Then he turned to me. "I was rather mean in sending you in that password, but I felt as if I should go mad if I didn't see you. You're the only man living who really knows about me. You're the only human being who can give me a helping hand. It's strange, old man, the halt leading the blind, but so it is, and Vilboek's Farm is the damned essence of the matter. I've come to you to ask you for the love of God to tell me what I am to do." I guessed what had happened. "Betty Connor has told you something that I was to tell you." "Yes," said he, "this afternoon. And in her splendid way she offered to marry me." "What did you say?" "I said that I would give her my answer to morrow." "And what will that answer be?" "It is for you to tell me," said Boyce. "In order to undertake such a terrible responsibility," said I must know the whole truth concerning Althea Fenimore." "I've come here to tell it to you," said he. Chapter 23
of The Red Planet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Red Planet by William J. Locke. Chapter 23. It was to a priest rather than to a man that he made full confession of his grievous sin. He did not attempt to mitigate it or to throw upon another a share of the blame. From that attitude he did not vary a hair's breadth. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. That was the burthen of his avowal. I, knowing the strange mingling in his nature of brutality and sensitiveness, of animal and spiritual, and knowing something of the unstable character of Althea Fenimore, may more justly, I think, than he, sketch out the miserable prologue of the drama. That she was madly, recklessly in love with him, there can be no doubt. Nor can there be doubt that unconsciously she fired the passion in him. The deliberate, cold-blooded seducer of his friend's daughter, such as Boyce, in his confession, made himself out to be, is a rare phenomenon. Almost invariably it is the woman who tempts innocently and unknowingly, without intent to allure, still less with thought of wrong, but tempts all the same by the attraction which she cannot conceal, by the soft promise which she cannot keep out of her eyes. That was the beginning of it. Betty, whom he loved, and to whom he was engaged, was away from Wellingsford. In those days she was very much the young Diana, walking in search of chaste adventures, quite contented with the love that lay serenely warm in her heart, and thinking little of a passionate man's needs, perhaps starting away from too violent an expression of them, perhaps prohibiting them altogether. The psychology of the pre-war young girl absorbed, even though intellectually and for curiosity's sake, in the feminist movement, is yet to be studied. Betty, then, was away. Althea, beata possidens, made her artless, innocent appeal for victory. Unconsciously she tempted. The man yielded. A touch of the lips in a moment of folly, the man blazed, the woman helpless was consumed. This happened in January, just before Althea's supposed visit to Scotland. Boyce was due at a country house party near Carlisle. In the first flush of their madness, they agreed upon the wretched plan. She took rooms in the town, and he visited her there. Whether he or she conceived it, I do not know. If I could judge coldly, I should say that it was of feminine inspiration. A man, particularly one of Boyce's temperament, who was eager for the possession of a passionately loved woman, would have carried her off to a little Eden of their own. A calm consideration of the facts leads to the suggestion of a half-hearted acquiescence on the part of an entangled man in the romantic scheme of an inexperienced girl, to whom he had suddenly become all in all. Such is my plea in extenuation of Boyce's conduct, if plea there can be, seeing that he raised not a shadow of one of his own. You may say that my plea is no excuse for his betrayal, that no man, even if he is tempted, can be pardoned for non-control of his passions. But I am asking for no pardon, I am trying to obtain your understanding. Remember what I have told you about Boyce, his great bull neck, his blood-sodden life-preserver, the physical repulsion I felt when he carried me in his arms. In such men the animal instinct is stronger at times than the trained will. Whether you give him a measure of your sympathy or not, at any rate do not believe that his short-lived liaison with Althea was a matter of deliberate and dastardly seduction. Nor must you think that I am setting down anything in disparagement of a child whom I once loved. Long ago I touched lightly on the anomaly of Althea's character, her mid-Victorian sentimentality and softness, combined with her modern spirit of independence. A fatal anomaly, a perilous balance of qualities. Once the soft sentimentality was warmed into romantic passion, the modern spirit led it recklessly to a modern conclusion. The liaison was short-lived. The man was remorseful. He loved another woman. Very quickly did the poor girl awaken from her dream. "I was cruel," said Boyce, fixing me with those awful black spectacles. "I know it. I ought to have married her. But if I had married her, I should have been more cruel. I should have hated her. It would have been an impossible life for both of us. One day I had to tell her so. Not brutally. In a normal state I think I am as kind-hearted and gentle as most men. And I couldn't be brutal, feeling an unutterable cur and craving her forgiveness. But I wanted Betty, and I swore that only one thing should keep me from her." "One thing?" I asked. "The thing that didn't happen," said he. And so it seemed that Althea accepted the inevitable. The placid, fatalistic side of her nature asserted itself. Pride, too, helped her instinctive feminine secretiveness. She lived for months in her father's house without giving those that were dear to her any occasion for suspicion. In order to preserve the secrecy, Boyce was bound to continue his visits to Wellings Park. Now and then, when they met alone, she upbraided him bitterly. On the whole, however, he concluded that they had agreed to bury an ugly chapter in their lives. Yes, it was an ugly chapter. From such you cannot get away, bury it, as you will, never so deep. "And all the time remember," he said, "that I was mad for Betty. The more shy she was, the madder I grew. I could not rest in Wellingsford without her. When she came here, I came. When she went to town, I went to town. She was as elusive as a dream. Finally, I pinned her down to a date for our marriage in August. It was the last time I saw her. She went away to stay with friends. That was the beginning of June. She was to be away 2 months. I knew, if I had clamoured, she would have made it 3. It was the shyness of the exquisite bird in her that fascinated me. I could never touch Betty in those days without dreading lest I might soil her feathers. You may laugh at a hulking brute like me saying such things, but that's the way I saw Betty, that's the way I felt towards her. I could no more have taken her into my bear's hug and kissed her roughly than I could have smashed a child down with my fist. And yet, my God, man, how I ached for her! Long as I had loved Betty in a fatherly way, deeply as I loved her now, the man's unexpected picture of her was a revelation. You see, it was only after her marriage, when she had softened and grown a woman, and come so near me, that I felt the great comfort of her presence when she was by, the need of it when she was away. How could I have known anything of the elusiveness in her maidenhood before which he knelt so reverently? That he so knelt is the keynote of the man's soul untainted by the flesh. It made clear to me the tenderness that lay beneath that which was brutal, the reason of that personal charm which had captivated me against my will, his defencelessness against the Furies. So far the narrative has reached the latter part of June. He had spent the month with his mother. As Betty had ordained that July should be blank, a month during which the moon should know no changes, but only the crescent of Diana should shine supreme in the heavens, he had made his mundane arrangements for his fishing excursion to Norway. On the afternoon of the 23rd he paid a farewell call at Wellings Park. Althea, in the final settlement of their relations, had laid it down as a definite condition that he should maintain his usual social intercourse with the family. A few young people were playing tennis. Tea was served on the lawn near by the court. Althea gave no sign of agitation. She played her game, laughed with her young men, and took casual leave of Boyce, wishing him good sport. He drew her a pace aside and murmured, "God bless you for forgiving me." She laughed a reply out loud, "Oh, that's all right." When he told me that, I recalled vividly the picture of her, in my garden, on the last afternoon of her life, eating the strawberries which she had brought me for tea. I remembered the little slangy tone in her voice when she had asked me whether I didn't think life was rather rotten. That was the tone in which she had said to him, "Oh, that's all right." During the early afternoon on the 25th she rang him up on the telephone. Chance willed that he should receive the call at first hand. She must see him before he left Wellingsford. She had something of the utmost importance to tell him, a matter of life and death. With one awful thought in his mind, he placed his time at her disposal. For what romantic, desperate, or tragic reason she appointed the night meeting at the end of the chestnut avenue, where the towing path turns into regions of desolate quietude, he could not tell. He agreed without argument, dreading the possible lack of privacy in their talk over the wires. On that afternoon she came to me, as I have told you, with her strawberries and her declaration of the rottenness of life. They met and walked along the towing path. It was bright moonlight, but she could not have chosen a lonelier spot, more free from curious eyes or ears. And then took place a scene which it is beyond my power to describe. I can only picture it to myself from Boyce's broken, self-accusing talk. He was going away. She would never see him again until he returned to marry another woman. She was making her last frantic bid for happiness. She wept and sobbed and cajoled and upbraided. You know what women at the end of their tether can do. He strove to pacify her by the old arguments which hitherto she had accepted. Suddenly she cried, "If you don't marry me, I am disgraced for ever." And this brought them to a dead halt. When he came to this point, I remembered the diabolical accuracy of Gedge's story. Boyce said, "There is one usual reason why a man should marry a woman to save her from disgrace. Is that the reason?" She said, "Yes." The light went out of the man's life. "In that case," said he, "there can be no question about it. I will marry you. But why didn't you tell me before?" She said she did not know. She made the faltering excuses of the driven girl. They walked on together and sat on the great bar of the Locke gates. "Till then," said he, "I had never known what it was to have death in my heart. But I swear to God, Meredith, I played my part like a man. I had done a dastardly thing. There was nothing left for me but to make reparation. In a few moments I tore my life asunder. The girl I had wronged was to be the mother of my child. I accepted the situation. I was as kind to her as I could be. She laid her head on my shoulder and cried, and I put my arm around her. I felt my heart going out to her in remorse and pity and tenderness. A man must be a devil who could feel otherwise. Our lives were bound up together. I kissed her and she clung to me. Then we talked for a while, ways and means. It was time to go back. We rose, and then, Meredith, this is what she said. "You swear to marry me?" "I swear it," said I. "In spite of anything?" I gave my promise. She put her arms round my neck. "What I've told you is not wholly true, but the moral disgrace is there all the time." I took her wrists and disengaged myself and held her and looked at her. "What do you mean, 'not wholly true'?" I asked. My God, I shall never forget it. He stuck both his elbows on the bed and clutched his hair and turned his black glasses wide of me. The child crumpled up. She seemed to shrivel like a leaf in the fire. She said, "I've tried to lie to you, but I can't. I can't. Pity me and forgive me." I started back from her in a sudden fury. I could not forgive her. Think of the awful revulsion of feeling. Foolishly tricked. I was mad with anger. I walked away and left her. I must have walked 10 or 15 yards. Then I heard a splash in the water. I turned. She was no longer on the bank. I ran up. I heard a cry. I just saw her sinking. And I couldn't move. As God hears me, it is true. I knew I must dive in and rescue her. I had run up with every impulse to do so. But I could not move. I stood shivering with the paralysis of fear. Fear of the deep black water, the steep brick sides of the canal that seemed to stretch away for ever. Fear of death, I suppose that was it. I don't know. Fear, irresistible, unconquerable, gripped me, as it had gripped me before, as it has gripped me since. And she drowned before my eyes, while I stood like a stone. There was an awful pause. He had told me the end of the tragedy so swiftly and in a voice so keyed to the terror of the scene that I lay horror-stricken, unable to speak. He buried his face in his hands, and between the fleshy part of the palms I saw the muscles of his lips twitch horribly. I remembered, with a shiver, how I had first seen them twitch in his mother's house, when he had made his strange, almost passionate apology for fear. And he had all but described this very incident, the reckless hare-brained devil standing on the bank of a river and letting a wounded comrade drown. I remember how he had defined it: the sudden thing that hits a man's heart and makes him stand stock still like a living corpse, unable to move a muscle, all his will-power out of gear, just as a motor is out of gear. It is as much of a fit as epilepsy. The span of stillness was unbearable. The watch on the little table by my bedside ticked maddeningly. Marigold put his head in at the door, apparently to warn me that it was getting late. I waved him imperiously away. Boyce did not notice his entrance. Presently he raised his head. I don't know how long I stood there, but I know that when I moved she was long since past help. Suddenly there was a sharp crashing noise on the road below. I looked round and saw no one, but it gave me a shock, and I ran. I ran like a madman, and I thought as I ran that, if I were discovered, I should be hanged for murder. For who would believe my story? Who would believe it now? "I believe it, Boyce," I said. "Yes, you. You know something of the hell my life has been, but who else? He had every motive for the crime, the lawyers would say. They could prove it. But, my God, what motive had I for sending all my gallant fellows to their deaths at Vilboek's Farm? The two things are on all fours, and many other things with them. My one sane thought through the horror of it all was to get home and into the house unobserved. Then I came upon the man Gedge, who had spied on me." "I know about that," said I, wishing to spare him from saying more than was necessary. "He told Fenimore and me about it." "What was his version?" he asked in a low tone. I had better hear it. When I had told him, he shook his head. "He lied. He was saving his skin. I was not such a fool, mad as I was, as to leave him like that. He had seen us together. He had seen me alone. To-morrow there would be a discovery. I offered him £1,000 to say nothing. He haggled. Oh, the ghastly business! Eventually I suggested that he should come up to London with me by the first train in the morning and discuss the money. I was dreading lest someone should come along the avenue and see me. He agreed. I think I drank a bottle of whisky that night. It kept me alive. We met in my chambers in London. I had sent my man up the day before to do some odds and ends for me. I made a clear breast of it to Gedge. He believed the worst. I don't blame him. I bought his silence for 1,000 a year. I made arrangements for payment through my bankers. I went to Norway. But I went alone. I didn't fish. I put off the 2 men I was to join. I spent over a month all by myself. I don't think I could tell you a thing about the place. I walked and walked all day until I was exhausted, and got sleep that way. I'm sure I was going mad. I should have gone mad if it hadn't been for the war. I suppose I'm the only Englishman, living or dead, who whooped and danced from exultation when he heard of it. I think my brain must have been a bit touched, for I laughed and cried and jumped about in a pine wood with a week-old newspaper in my hands. I came home. You know the rest. Yes, I knew the rest. The woman he had left to drown had been ever before his eyes, the avenging furies in pursuit. This was the torture in his soul that had led him to many a mad challenge of death, who always scorned his defiance. Yes, I knew all that he could tell me. But we went on talking. There were a few points I wanted cleared up. Why should he have kept up a correspondence with Gedge? "I only wrote one foolish angry letter," he replied. And I told him how Sir Anthony had thrown it unread into the fire. Gedge's nocturnal waylaying of him in my front garden was another unsuccessful attempt to tighten the screw. Like Randall and myself, he had no fear of Gedge. Of Sir Anthony he could not speak. He seemed to be crushed by the heroic achievement. It was the only phase of our interview during which, by voice and manner and attitude, he appeared to me like a beaten man. His own bravery at the reception had gone for naught. He was overwhelmed by the hideous insolence of it. "I shall never get that man's voice out of my ears as long as I live," he said hoarsely. After a while he added, I wonder whether there is any rest or purification for me this side of the grave." I said tentatively, for we had never discussed matters of religion, "If you believe in Christ, you must believe in the promise regarding the sins that be as scarlet." But he turned it aside. In the olden days men like me turned monk and found salvation in fasting and penance. The times in which we live have changed, and we with them, my friend. Nos mulamur in illis, as the tag goes. We went on talking, or rather he talked, and I listened. Now and again he would help himself to a drink or a cigarette, and I marvelled at the clear assurance with which he performed the various little operations. I, lying in bed, lost all sense of pain, almost of personality. My little ailments, my little selfish love of Betty, my little humdrum life itself dwindled insignificant before the tragic intensity of this strange, curse-ridden being. And all the time we had not spoken of Betty, except the Betty of long ago. It was I, finally, who gave him the lead. "And Betty?" said I. He held out his hand in a gesture that was almost piteous. "I could tear her from my life. I had no alternative. In the tearing I hurt her cruelly. To know it was not the least of the burning hell I lit for myself, but I couldn't tear her from my heart. When a brute beast like me does love a woman purely and ideally, it's a desperate business. It means God's heaven to him, while it means only an earthly paradise to the ordinary man. It clutches hold of the one bit of immortal soul he has left, and nothing in this world can make it let go. That's why I say it's a desperate business." "Yes, I can understand," said I. "I schooled myself to the loss of her. It was part of my punishment. But now she has come back into my life. Fate has willed it so. Does it mean that I am forgiven?" "By whom?" I asked. "By God?" "By whom else?" "How dare man," said I, "speak for the Almighty?" "How is man to know?" "That's a hard question," said I. "I can only think of answering it by saying that a man knows of God's forgiveness by the measure of the peace of God in his soul." "There's none of it in mine, my dear chap, and never will be," said Boyce. I strove to help him. For what other purpose had he come to me? "You think then that the sending of Betty is a sign and a promise? Yes, perhaps it is. What then?" "I must accept it as such," said he. "If there is a God, he would not give me back the woman I love only to take her away again. What shall I do?" "In what way?" I asked. "She offered to marry me. I am to give her my answer to-morrow. If I were the callous, murdering brute that everyone would have the right to believe I am, I shouldn't have hesitated. If I hadn't been a tortured, damned soul," he cried, bringing his great fist down on the bed, "I shouldn't have come here to ask you what my answer can be. My whole being is infected with horror." He rose and stood over the bed, and, with clenched hands, gesticulated to the wall in front of him. "I'm incapable of judging. I only know that I crave her with everything in me. I've got it in my brain that she's my soul's salvation. Is my brain right? I don't know. I come to you, a clean, sweet man who knows everything. I don't think there's a crime on my conscience or a foulness in my nature which I haven't confessed to you. You can judge straight, as I can't. What answer shall I give to-morrow?" Did ever man, in a case of conscience, have a greater responsibility? God forgive me if I solved it wrongly. At any rate, he knows that I was uninfluenced by mean personal considerations. All my life I have tried to live an honourable gentleman and a Christian man. According to my lights, I saw only one clear course. "Sit down, old man," said I. "You're a bit too big for me like that." He felt for his chair, sat down, and leaned back. "You've done almost everything," I continued, "that a man can do in expiation of offences. But there is one thing more that you must do in order to find peace. You couldn't find peace if you married Betty and left her in ignorance. You must tell Betty everything, everything that you have told me. Otherwise you would still be hag-ridden. If she learned the horror of the thing afterwards, what would be your position? Acquit your conscience now before God and a splendid woman, and I stake my faith in each that neither will fail you." After a few minutes, during which the man's face was like a mask, he said, "That's what I wanted to know. That's what I wanted to be sure of. Do you mind ringing your bell for Marigold to take me away? I've kept you up abominably." He rose and held out his hand, and I had to direct him how it could reach mine. When it did, he gripped it firmly. "It's impossible," said he, "for you to realise what you've done for me to-night. You've made my way absolutely clear to me. For the first time for 2 years. You're the truest comrade I've ever had, Meredith. God bless you." Marigold appeared, answering my summons, and led Boyce away. Presently he returned. "Do you know what time it is, sir?" he asked serenely. "No," said I. "It's 1:30." He busied himself with my arrangements for the night, and administered what I learned afterwards was a double dose of a sleeping draught which Cliff had prescribed for special occasions. I just remember surprise at feeling so drowsy after the intense excitement of the evening, and then I fell asleep. When I awoke in the morning I gathered my wits together and recalled what had taken place. Marigold entered on tiptoe and found me already aroused. "I'm sorry to tell you, sir," said he, "that an accident happened to Colonel Boyce after he left last night." "An accident?" "I suppose so, sir," said Marigold. "That's what his chauffeur says. He got out of the car in order to sit by the side of the canal, by the Locke gates. He fell in, sir. He's drowned." End of Chapter 23. Read by Kara Schallenberg. www.kray.org. November 15th, 2009. In San Diego, California. Chapter 24 of The Red Planet. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Red Planet by William J. Locke. Chapter 24. It is Christmas morning, 1916, the third Christmas of the war. The tragedy of Boyce's death happened 6 months ago. Since then I have been very ill. The shock, too great for my silly heart, nearly killed me. By all the rules of the game I ought to have died. But I suppose, like a brother officer long since defunct, also a major, one Joe Bagstock, I am devilish tough. Cliff told me this morning that, apart from a direct hit by a 42-centimeter shell, he saw no reason, after what I had gone through, why I should not live for another 100 years. "I wash my hands of you," said he, which indeed is pleasant hearing. I don't mind dying a bit, if it is my Maker's pleasure, if it would serve any useful purpose, if it would help my country a myriadth part of a millimeter on towards victory. But if it would not matter to the world any more than the demise of a daddy-long-legs, I prefer to live. In fact, I want to live. I have never wanted to live more in all my life. I want to see this fight out. I want to see the light that is coming after the darkness. For, by God, it will come. And I want to live, too, for personal and private reasons. If I could regard myself merely as a helpless encumbrance, a useless jellyfish, absorbing for my maintenance human effort that should be beneficially exerted elsewhere, I think I should be the first to bid them take me out and bury me. But it is my wonderful privilege to look around and see great and beautiful human souls coming to me for guidance and consolation. Why this should be I do not rightly know. Perhaps my very infirmity has taught me many lessons. You see, in the years past my life was not without its lonelinesses. It was so natural for the lusty and joyous to disregard, through mere thoughtlessness, the little weather-beaten cripple in his wheel-chair. But when one of these sacrificed an hour's glad life in order to sit by the dull chair in a corner, the cripple did not forget it. He learned in its terrible intensity the meaning of human kindness. And in his course through the years, or as the years coursed by him, he realized that a pair of gollywog legs was not the worst disability which a human being might suffer. There were gollywog hearts, brains, nerves, temperaments, destinies. Perhaps in this way he came to the knowledge that in every human being lies the spark of immortal beauty, to be fanned into flame by one little rightly directed breath. At any rate, he learned to love his kind. It is Christmas Day. I am as happy as a man has a right to be in these fierce times in England. Love is all around me. I must tell you, little by little. Various things have happened during the last 6 months. At the inquest on the body of Leonard Boyce, the jury gave a verdict of death by misadventure. The story of the chauffeur, an old soldier servant devoted to Boyce, received implicit belief. He had faithfully carried out his master's orders, to conduct him from the road, across the field, and seat him on the boom of the Locke gates, where he wanted to remain alone, in order to enjoy the quiet of the night, and listen to the lap of the water, to return and fetch him in a quarter of an hour. This he did, dreaming of no danger. When he came back he realized what had happened. His master had got up and fallen into the canal. What had really happened, only a few of us knew. Well, I have told you the man's story. I am not his judge. Whether his act was the supreme amende, the supreme act of courage, or the supreme act of cowardice, it is not for me to say. I heard nothing of the matter for many weeks, for they took me off to a nursing home and kept me in the deathly stillness of a sepulchre. When I resumed my life in Wellingsford, I found smiling faces to welcome me. My first public action was to give away Phyllis Gedge in marriage to Randall Holmes. Randall Holmes in the decent kit of an officer and a gentleman. He made this proposition to me on the first evening of my return. "The bride's father," said I, somewhat ironically, "is surely the proper person." "The bride's father," said he, "is miles away, and, like a wise and hoary villain, is likely to remain there." This was news. "Gedge has left Wellingsford?" I cried. "How did that come about?" He stuck his hands on his hips and looked down on me pityingly. "I'm afraid, sir," said he, "you'll never do adequate justice to my intelligence and my capacity for affairs." Then he laughed, and I guessed what had occurred. My young friend must have paid a stiff price, but Phyllis and peace were worth it, and I have said that Randall is a young man of fortune. "My dear boy," said I, "if you have exorcised this devil of a father-in-law of yours out of Wellingsford, I'll do any mortal thing you ask." I was almost ecstatic. For think what it meant to those whom I held dear. The man's evil menace was removed from the midst of us. The man's evil voice was silenced. The tragic secrets of the canal would be kept. I looked up at my young friend. There was a grim humour around the corners of his mouth, and in his eyes the quiet masterfulness of those who have looked scornfully at death. I realized that he had reached a splendid manhood. I realized that Gedge had realized it too. Woe be to him if he played Randall false. I stuck out my hand. "Any mortal thing," I repeated. He regarded me steadily. "Anything? Do you really mean it?" "You dashed young idiot!" I cried. "Do you think I'm in the habit of talking through my hat?" "Well," said he, "will you look after Phyllis when I'm gone?" "Gone? Gone where? Eternity?" "No, no, I've only a fortnight's leave. Then I'm off. Wherever they send me. Secret Service, you know. It's no use planking Phyllis in a dug-out of her own. Shades of Oxford and the Albemarle Review. She'd die of loneliness, and she'd die of culture in the mater's high-brow establishment. Whereas, if you would take her in, give her a shake-down here, she wouldn't give much trouble." He stammered, as even the most audacious young warrior must do when making so astounding a proposal. But I bade him not be an ass, but send her along when he had to finish with her, with the result that for some months my pretty little Phyllis has been an inmate of my house. Marigold keeps a sort of non-commissioned parent's eye on her. To him she seems to be still the child whom he fed solicitously, but unemotionally, with Mrs. Marigold's cakes at tea-parties, years ago. She gives me a daughter's dainty affection. Thank God for it. There have been other little changes in Wellingsford. Mrs. Boyce left the town soon after Leonard's death, and lives with her sister in London. I had a letter from her this morning, a brave woman's letter. She has no suspicion of the truth. God still tempereth the wind. Out of the innocent generosity of her heart she sent me also, as a keepsake, a little heavy cane of which Leonard was extraordinarily fond. She will never know that I put it into the fire, and with what strange and solemn thoughts I watched it burn. It is Christmas Day. Dr. Cliffe, although he has washed his hands of me, tyrannically keeps me indoors of winter nights, so that I cannot, as usual, dine at Wellings Park. To counter the fellow's machinations, however, I have prepared a modest feast, to which I have bidden Sir Anthony and Lady Fenimore and my dearest Betty. As to Betty... Phyllis comes in radiant, her pretty face pink above an absurd panoply of furs. She has had a long letter from Randall from the Lord knows where. He will be home on leave in the middle of January. In her excitement, she drops prayer books and hymn books all over me, then, picking them up, reminds me it is time to go to church. I am an old-fashioned fogey, and I go to church on Christmas Day. I hope our admirable and conscientious vicar won't feel it his duty to tell us to love Germans. I simply can't do it. New Year's Day, 1917. I must finish off this jumble of a chronicle. Before us lies the most eventful year in all the old world's history. Thank God my beloved England is strong, and Great Britain and our great empire and immortal France. There is exhilaration in the air, a consciousness of high ideals, an unwavering resolution to attain them, a thrilling faith in their ultimate attainment. No one has died or lost sight or limbs in vain. I look around my own little circle. Oswald Fenimore, Willie Connor, Reggie Dacre, Leonard Boyce. How many more could I not add to the list? All those little burial grounds in France, which France, with her exquisite sense of beauty, has assigned as British soil for all time. All those burial grounds, each bearing its modest, leaden inscription, some, indeed, heart-rendingly inscribed, "Sacred to the memory of 6 unknown British soldiers killed in action," are monuments not to be bedewed with tears of lamentation. From the young lives that have gone there springs imperishable love and strength and wisdom, and the vast determination to use that love and strength and wisdom for the great good of mankind. If there is a God of battles, guiding, in his inscrutable omniscience, the hosts that fight for the eternal verities, for all that man in his straining towards the Godhead has striven for since the world began, the men who have died will come into their glory, and those who have mourned will share exultant in the victory. From the beginning of time, Mithra has ever been triumphant, and his foot on the throat of Ahriman. It was in February 1915 that I began to expand my diary into this narrative, nearly 2 years ago. We have passed through the darkness. The dawn is breaking. Sursum corda. I was going to tell you about Betty when Phyllis, with her furs and happiness and hymn books, interrupted me. I should like to tell you now, but who am I to speak of the mysteries in the soul of a great woman? But I must try, and I can tell you more now than I could on Christmas Day. Last night she insisted on seeing the New Year in with me. If I had told Marigold that I proposed to sit up after midnight, he would have come in at 10 o'clock, picked me up with finger and thumb, as any Brobdingnagian might have picked up Gulliver, and put me straight away to bed. But Betty made the announcement in her airily imperious way, and Marigold, craven before Betty and Mrs. Marigold, said, "Very good, madam," as if Dr. Cliffe and his orders had never existed. At 10:30 she packed off the happy and, I must confess, the somewhat sleepy Phyllis, and sat down, in her old attitude by the side of my chair, in front of the fire, and opened her dear heart to me. I had guessed what her proud soul had suffered during the last 6 months. One who loved her as I did could see it in her face, in her eyes, in the little hardening of her voice, in odd little betrayals of feverishness in her manner. But the outside world saw nothing. The steel in her nature carried her through. She left no duty unaccomplished. She gave her confidence to no human being. I, to whom she might have come, was carried off to the sepulchre above mentioned. Letters were forbidden. But every day, for all her bleak despair, Betty sent me a box of fresh flowers. They would not tell me it was Betty who sent them, but I knew. My wonderful Betty. When they took off my cerecloths and sent me back to Wellingsford, Betty was the first to smile her dear welcome. We resumed our old relations, but Betty, treating me as an invalid, forbore to speak of Leonard Boyce. Any approach on my part came up against that iron wall of reserve of which I spoke to you long ago. But last night she told me all. What she said I cannot repeat, but she had divined the essential secret of the double tragedy of the canal. It had become obvious to her that he had made the final reparation for a wrong far deeper than she had imagined. She was very clear-eyed and clear-souled. During her long companionship with pain and sorrow and death, she had learned many things. She had been purged by the fire of the war of all resentments, jealousies, harsh judgments, and came forth pure gold. Leonard had been the great love of her life. If you cannot see now why she married Willie Connor, gave him all that her generous heart could give, and after his death was irresistibly drawn back to Boyce, I have written these pages in vain. A few minutes before midnight Marigold entered with a tray bearing a cake or two, a pint of champagne, and a couple of glasses. While he was preparing to uncork the bottle, Betty slipped from the room and returned with another glass. "For Sergeant Marigold," she said. She opened the French window behind the drawn curtains and listened. It was a still clear night. Presently the clock of the parish church struck 12. She came down to the little table by my side and filled the glasses, and the three of us drank the new year in. Then Betty kissed me, and we both shook hands with Marigold, who stood very stiff and determined, and cleared his throat, and swallowed something as though he were expected to make a speech. But Betty anticipated him. She put both her hands on his gaunt shoulders and looked up into his ugly face. "You've just wished me a Happy New Year, Sergeant." "I have," said he, "and I mean it." "Then will you let me have great happiness in staying here and helping you to look after the Major?" He gasped for a moment, as did I, and clutched her arms for an instant in an iron grip. "Indeed I will, my dear," said he. Then he stepped back a pace and stood rigid, his one eye staring, his weather-beaten face the colour of beetroot. He was blushing. The beads of perspiration appeared below his awful wig. He stammered out something about "ma'am" and "madam." He had never so far forgotten himself in his life. But Betty sprang forward and gripped his hand. "It is you who are the dear," she said. "You, the greatest and loyalest friend a man has ever known, and I'll be loyal to you, never fear." By what process of enchantment she got an emotion-filled Marigold to the door and shut it behind him, I shall never discover. On its slam she laughed, a queer high note. In one swift movement she was by my knees, and she broke into a passion of tears. For me, I was the most mystified man under heaven. Soon she began to speak, her head bowed. "I've come to the end of the tether, Majy dear. They've driven me from the hospital. I didn't know how to tell you before. I've been doing all sorts of idiotic things. The doctors say it's a nervous breakdown. I've had rather a bad time, but I thought it contemptible to let one's own wretched little miseries interfere with one's work for the country. So I fought as hard as I could. Indeed I did, Majy dear. But it seems I've been playing the fool without knowing it. I haven't slept properly for months, and they've sent me away. Oh, they've been all that's kind, of course. I must have at least 6 months' rest, they say. They talk about nursing homes. I've thought and thought and thought about it until I'm certain. There's only one rest for me, Majy dear." She raised a tear-stained, tense, and beautiful face, and drew herself up, so that one arm leaned on my chair, and the other on my shoulder. "And that is to be with the one human being that is left for me to love, oh, really love, you know what I mean, in the world." I could only put my hand on her fair young head and say, my dear, you know I love you." "That is why I'm not afraid to speak. Perfect love casteth out fear." I pushed back her hair. "What is it that you want me to do, Betty?" I asked. "My life, such as it is at your command." She looked me full, unflinchingly in the eyes. "If you would give me the privilege of bearing your name, I should be a proud and happy woman." We remained there, I don't know how long, she with her hand on my shoulder, I caressing her dear hair. It was a tremendous temptation to have my beloved Betty in all her exquisite warm loyalty bound to me for the rest of my crippled life, but I found the courage to say, "My dear, you are young still, with the wonderful future that no one alive can foretell before you, and I am old." "You're not 50." "Still, I am old. I belong to the past, to a sort of affray behind an ant-hill which they called a war. I'm dead, my dear. You are gloriously alive. I'm of the past, as I say. You're of the future. You, my dearest, are the embodiment of the woman of the Great War." I smiled. "The woman of the Great War," in capital letters. "What your destiny is, God knows, but it isn't to be tied to a prehistoric man like me." She rose and stood, with her beautiful bare arms behind her, sweet, magnificent. I am a woman of the Great War, you are quite right, but in a year or so I shall be like other women of the war who have suffered and spent their lives, a woman of the past, not of the future. All sorts of things have been burned up in it. In a quick gesture she stretched out her hands to me. Oh, can't you understand? I cannot set down the rest of the tender argument. If she had loved me less, she could have lived in my house like Phyllis, without a thought of the conventions. But loving me dearly, she had got it into her feminine head that the sacredness of the marriage tie would crown with dignity and beauty the part she had resolved to play for my happiness. Well, if I have yielded, I pray it may not be set down to me for selfish exploitation of a woman's exhausted hour. When I said something of the sort, she laughed and cried, "Why, I'm bullying you into it." The 1st of January, 1917, the dawn to me, a broken derelict of the annus mirabilis. Somehow, foolishly, illogically, I feel that it will be the annus mirabilis for my beloved country. And come, after all, I am, in spite of my legs, a man too of the Great War. I have lived in it, and worked in it, and suffered in it, and in it I have won a great thing. So long as one's soul is sound, that is the great matter. Just before we parted last night, I said to Betty, "The beginning and end of all this business is that you're afraid of Marigold." She started back indignantly. "I'm not, I'm not." I laughed. "The lady protests too much," said I. The clock struck 2. Marigold appeared at the door. He approached Betty. "I think, madam, we ought to let the Major go to bed." "I think, Marigold," said Betty serenely, "we ought to be ashamed of ourselves for keeping him up so late." The End. End of Chapter 24, read by Kara Schallenberg, November 2009, and the end of The Red Planet by William J. Locke.